You know, language is one of the most complicated human behaviors. Virtually every human being learns to use language by the time they're 2 or 3 years old. And everyone uses language every day in one way or another, either in speaking, in reading, or in writing. Therefore, everyone influences how language is used. They influence how language is spoken, heard, written, and understood. Therefore, the study of language is one of the most complicated of all subjects, and almost any grammar rule or rule about how to use language correctly is bound to have exceptions. In this program, we'll focus on the least you need to know. In other words, we'll try to take the complicated subject of grammar and make it easy for you. What we want to do is provide you with the rules and information that you need to communicate in English clearly, effectively, and correctly. Everyone is able to convey their meaning eventually. No one has ever starved to death because they weren't able to convey the fact that they were hungry. But some forms of language are more likely to please, to impress, and to influence other people. And therefore, using correct grammar and being able to express yourself properly is going to be more effective in your everyday life. It's a little bit like using proper table manners or dressing appropriately. It's not strictly necessary, but it's a very good idea. In addition, knowing and using the proper rules of English grammar will enable you to score higher on tests of English and to do better in school. So for all these reasons, studying and learning the basics of English grammar is also very important for anyone who is studying English as a second language. With that in mind, let's begin this program dealing with sentence structure. Let's begin by discussing what is a sentence. A sentence is a group of words that expresses a complete thought. You can contrast a sentence with a sentence fragment. A sentence fragment is a kind of mistake that people sometimes make in writing English. A sentence fragment is a group of words that doesn't express a complete thought. Now, sentence fragments are often used when people are casually speaking to one another, but a sentence fragment is considered a mistake in writing. Here's the reason. A sentence fragment, a group of words that doesn't express a complete thought by itself, may be clear in a conversation because people are talking back and forth, and this context gives meaning to the sentence fragment. In writing, however, there is no conversation to give a context and therefore to explain the meaning of the sentence fragment. So a sentence fragment which might be clear in conversation is not clear in writing. That's why when you're writing English, you want to write in complete sentences, not in sentence fragments. Consider, for example, this group of words. Out to lunch. Is this a sentence or a sentence fragment? Well, it's a sentence fragment because it doesn't express a complete thought. Out to lunch doesn't tell us who is out to lunch or explain what the meaning of those words out to lunch really is. The words out to lunch could become part of a complete sentence, of course. You could say, Susan and I are going out to lunch. Or, Frank was out to lunch when I visited his office. Now we have a complete thought, and therefore a complete sentence. But by themselves, the words out to lunch are a fragment rather than a complete sentence. Or consider these words. Maybe later. Is this a sentence or a sentence fragment? Again, it's a sentence fragment. The words maybe later by themselves don't express a complete thought. Now you could imagine having a conversation in which someone would say, maybe later, in answer to a question. In a conversation, a sentence fragment like this can be meaningful and can be understood. For example, you might say to someone, oh, do you feel like having a bite of lunch right now? And your friend might answer, maybe later. In the context of the conversation, you can understand what the sentence fragment means. But if the words maybe later appeared by themselves in a piece of writing, you probably wouldn't understand what the words were referring to. That's what makes it a sentence fragment and therefore incorrect in writing. So writing in English must consist of complete sentences. In writing, a sentence always begins with a capital letter. That's one of the larger letters that stands out on the page and indicates in English the beginning of a sentence. A sentence always ends with a punctuation mark, and there are a few different choices for punctuation marks that you can use to end a sentence. The most common punctuation mark to use to end a sentence is a period. The alternative choices are a question mark or an exclamation point. In a moment, we'll explain exactly how you would decide whether to use a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point to mark the end of a sentence. But in any case, the punctuation mark is necessary at the end of the sentence because it makes it easy for the reader to see when one sentence ends and the next one begins. Now, in English, there are four main kinds of sentences: declarative sentences, interrogative sentences, exclamatory sentences, and imperative sentences. Let's define each one and look at an example. A declarative sentence states a fact. Take a look at this example. The sun is shining today. This sentence states a fact about what today's weather is like. Therefore, it's a declarative sentence. The vast majority of English sentences that you'll encounter in reading and writing are declarative sentences. Notice that this sentence begins with a capital letter and ends with a period. Almost all declarative sentences end with periods. And again, this is the most common type of sentence that you're likely to encounter or that you'll be writing for school or for work. An interrogative sentence asks a question. Here's an example. Do you have any plans for this afternoon? When I say this interrogative sentence, I'm asking a question of whoever is listening to me. I'm asking them what they're planning to do this afternoon. An interrogative sentence ends with a question mark. That makes it clear to the reader that a question is being asked. And again, like all sentences, it begins with a capital letter. The third type of sentence is an exclamatory sentence. An exclamatory sentence expresses a strong emotion. Look at this example. What a beautiful day for a picnic. Maybe you could tell from the way I read that sentence aloud that I'm expressing a strong emotion or a strong feeling about what beautiful weather we have today. This makes it an exclamatory sentence, and it ends with an exclamation point. This is a special mark of punctuation that's used to indicate to the reader that strong emotions or feelings are being expressed in the sentence. The fourth type of sentence is an imperative sentence. An imperative sentence makes a request or gives an order. The person who hears an imperative sentence is being required to do something. Look at this example. Come with me. This is an imperative sentence because I'm inviting the person who hears the sentence to do something, namely, to come with me. An imperative sentence may end with a period or with an exclamation point. It all depends on how forceful the request or command or order is intended to be. A command or order which is given with a great deal of emotion and feeling and forcefulness might be ended with an exclamation point. Otherwise, a period will do. In this example, we've used an exclamation point to indicate that strong feelings are behind the invitation, come with me. These then are the four types of sentences: a declarative sentence, an interrogative sentence, an exclamatory sentence, and an imperative sentence. In most writing, declarative sentences are by far the most common. Interrogative sentences come second most frequent, and exclamatory and imperative sentences are very, very rare in writing. They're often used in speaking and conversation, but rarely in writing. So for the purposes of English grammar, as it affects your work and school use of English, the declarative and interrogative sentences are the most important. In your study guide, we've provided you with some exercises which will help to reinforce and allow you to practice the information and skills that we're covering in this program. Turn to your study guide now and go to the first exercise there, which deals with this topic of what is a sentence and the 4 types of sentences. Did you find this exercise difficult? Your job was to read 5 sentences and for each one to decide whether the sentence was a declarative sentence, an interrogative sentence, an exclamatory sentence, or an imperative sentence. We also threw in 1 sentence fragment, that is, a group of words that looks like a sentence but doesn't express a complete thought. Remember that in writing, a sentence fragment is incorrect. Let's look at the first sentence. When will tomorrow morning's band rehearsal begin? Perhaps you can tell by reading this sentence that it is asking a question. Therefore, this is an interrogative sentence, and it needs to end with a question mark. So that's the correct answer for this first question. Let's look at the second sentence. Always read the safety instructions before using a new power tool. What kind of sentence is this? Is it a declarative sentence? Does it state a fact? No, not really. Is it an interrogative sentence? Is it asking a question of you, the hearer? No, it isn't. Is it an exclamatory sentence? Is it expressing strong emotion? No, not really that either. It is an imperative sentence. Remember, an imperative sentence is one that makes a request or gives an order. And in this case, the sentence is giving an order or making a request of whoever reads it. It is telling that person that they ought to do something, namely to read the safety instructions before using a new power tool. Therefore, this is an imperative sentence. Remember that we said an imperative sentence may end with either a period or an exclamation point. It all depends on whether strong feeling or strong emotion is being expressed. In this case, no particularly strong emotion is being expressed, and therefore the correct way to end this sentence would be with a period. Let's look at our next example. Having spent over 2 hours working on her dance routine. Could you tell that this is the sentence fragment? This is a sentence fragment because it doesn't express a complete thought. There are a lot of words here, and we can see that someone spent over 2 hours working on her dance routine, but we can't really tell what's going on because it doesn't say who spent 2 hours on her dance routine. Therefore, the person who is doing the action is missing from this sentence, and what results is not a complete thought. We don't really understand what the person who wrote this sentence is trying to convey. This is a sentence fragment, not a complete sentence, and if it appeared in a piece of writing, it would be considered incorrect. Therefore, this is the sentence fragment and shouldn't be given any final punctuation because it's really not a complete sentence. Let's look at the next example. The local wildlife refuge is home to over 70 species of birds. This sentence states a fact. Therefore, it's a declarative sentence, the most common type of sentence in English, and it ought to be concluded with a simple period. Let's look at the final sentence. That was a fabulous party. Here is a sentence that expresses strong emotion. This is an exclamatory sentence. It ought to be marked with an exclamation point, which indicates that it's a sentence expressing strong feelings. The person who wrote or speaks this sentence is talking about how much they enjoyed the party and is expressing that with a lot of feeling. That's what makes this an exclamatory sentence and means that it should end with an exclamation point. Did you get all 5 of these questions right? I hope so. Now we're ready to move on to Lesson 2. Now we know what a sentence is, and we also know what the 4 basic kinds of sentences are. But let's take a step back. Remember that the topic for this program is sentence structure. Now, structure refers to the way anything is constructed or built or made. For example, A house is a structure that's made out of wood, bricks, and other materials. What is a sentence constructed from? Well, of course, the most basic unit is the word. But before we talk about individual words, we need to talk about some of the bigger parts that go to make up the structure of a sentence. In particular, there are two big parts into which most sentences can be divided. These two main parts are the subject and the predicate. Let's talk about each in a little more detail. The subject tells what the sentence is talking about. Now, the subject of a sentence may be only one word long, or it may include a number of words. In any case, the single most important word in the subject is the simple subject. The other words in the subject are there to give more information about the simple subject. And we'll see an example in a moment. The subject, then, is one part of the sentence, and the rest of the sentence, whatever is not part of the subject, is considered part of the predicate, which is the other main building block of a sentence. The predicate describes something that the subject is or does. The most important word in the predicate is called the verb. A verb is a word that expresses action or state of being. So we now have two main parts to the sentence. We have the subject, which names what the sentence is talking about, and the predicate, which tells what the subject is or does. Once again, within the predicate, there is one most important word to focus on, which is called the verb, and all the other words that are in the predicate are there to give more information about what the subject does. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of sentences and see how they can be divided into subject and predicate. Look at this example. My younger sister Ingrid once worked as a costume designer. Let's begin by looking for the subject of this sentence. Is there a word or a group of words that explains what the sentence is talking about? Yes, in this case, the first four words of the sentence make up the subject. Those four words tell us what the sentence is about. The sentence is about my younger sister Ingrid. Is there one word within that subject which is the most important word, the word that tells you specifically what the sentence is about? Yes, it's the last word, Ingrid. So Ingrid is the simple subject of this sentence. The other words in the subject are there to give more information about the simple subject. So the words my younger sister are there to give more information about Ingrid. They tell us a little bit more about who Ingrid is. Okay, if the first four words of this sentence are the subject, then the rest of the sentence must be the predicate. Remember that the predicate describes something that the subject is or does. Do the other words in this sentence describe something that Ingrid is or does? Yes, they describe something that Ingrid did at one time. Once worked as a costume designer. All of that is the predicate of the sentence. Notice how the subject and the predicate work together to express a complete thought. Either one by itself would be a sentence fragment. My younger sister Ingrid couldn't stand alone as a sentence. That's a sentence fragment. It doesn't express a complete thought. Once worked as a costume designer would also be a sentence fragment. Those words also don't express a complete thought by themselves. But when you combine the subject and the predicate, a complete thought is expressed. Now, is there one most important word in the predicate that tells exactly what Ingrid does, or in this case, did, because it's talking about something from the past? Yes, there is one word that is most important in the predicate. It's the word worked. Worked is the verb in this sentence, and it's the most important word. It tells us exactly what Ingrid did. She worked. Notice that all the other words in the predicate give us more information about what Ingrid did. The word once, for example, tells us when she did it, at one time in the past. And the words as a costume designer give us more information about exactly how she worked, what kind of job she worked at. So all the other words in the predicate are there to give us more information about what Ingrid did. But the word worked is the most important word. It's the verb. So the heart of this sentence is the subject and the predicate, and in particular, the one-word simple subject and the verb. Ingrid worked. And all the other words in the subject and the predicate are there to give us more information about how and when and at what Ingrid worked. Let's take a look at another example. She enjoys creating things with her hands. Can you identify the subject in this sentence? In this case, the subject is only one word long, she. That word all by itself tells us who or what the sentence is about. All the rest of the sentence is the predicate. It tells us what the subject is or does. The rest of the sentence, enjoys creating things with her hands, tells us something about what the subject does. The subject, she, one word long, and therefore the subject and the simple subject are exactly the same. Focusing on the predicate for a moment, is there one word there that's most important? The verb, which tells us exactly what the subject does. Yes, the verb, the most important word in the predicate, is enjoys. That tells us exactly what the subject, she, does. She enjoys. And the other words in the predicate tell us more information about what she enjoys. She enjoys creating things. And how does she create them? With her hands. So all the other words in the predicate give us more information about exactly what the subject does. But enjoys is the most important word in the predicate. It's the verb. Again, the heart of this sentence is she enjoys. And the other words, the remaining words in the predicate, are there to give more information. In this particular sentence, then, we have a very short subject, and the rest of the sentence, the predicate, tells us what the subject does. Now, occasionally, this kind of simple sentence structure gets a little more complicated with the addition of a compound subject. What is a compound subject? A compound subject is two or more things that work together as the subject. Usually, these two or more things are joined together by the word and or the word or. Look at this example. Dogs and cats sometimes enjoy living together. What's the subject of this sentence? Well, the subject of this sentence is the first three words, dogs and cats. That's what the sentence is about. All the rest is the predicate. It tells what dogs and cats do. Now, what's the simple subject of this sentence? Is it dogs? Is it cats? Well, really, it's both. The sentence isn't only about dogs, and it's not only about cats. It's about both. And since we have two subjects that are joined by the word and, we would consider this a compound subject. So the entire subject is both words and the word and between them. Dogs and cats all together go to make up the subject as well as the simple subject. In this case, a compound subject exists in this sentence. Looking for a moment at the predicate of this sentence, sometimes enjoy living together. Is there one most important word that expresses exactly what the dogs and cats do? The word is enjoy. That's the verb in this sentence, the most important word in the predicate, and it tells us what the dogs and cats do. They enjoy. And the other words in the predicate tell us more about exactly what they enjoy. They enjoy living together. And when they do it, sometimes. Just as a subject can be compound, a verb can also be compound. When a subject is compound, it means that there are two or more things that are acting together in the sentence. Can you guess what a compound verb would be? Well, that's when you have a subject which is doing two or more things. A compound verb is two or more verbs that describe what the subject does. Again, joined by the word and or. Here's an example. The giant tree bent and swayed in the wind. What's the subject in this sentence? The answer is the giant tree. That's what the sentence is about. Is there a one-word simple subject? Yes, it's the word tree. The other words, the giant, are there to tell you more about the tree, to describe it a little bit. Now, the rest of the sentence is the predicate, bent and swayed in the wind. Now, is there a most important word in the predicate, a word that tells you exactly what the tree did? Well, the fact is there are two words that tell you two things that the tree did. It bent, but it also swayed. So those two words, bent and swayed, are both equally important. They're both verbs. They both describe actions that the tree took, and they're connected by the word and. So in this sentence, we have a compound verb. That is, two verbs joined by the word and, both of which describe what the subject is doing. So the heart of this sentence is tree bent and swayed. And the other words in the sentence are there to give us more information about what kind of tree it was and how and when the tree bent and swayed. So as we see, in some sentences, you may have a compound subject, that is, two or more subjects joined by the word and or. And in some sentences, you may have a compound verb, that is, two or more verbs joined by the word and or. You may even have, in certain sentences, both a compound subject and a compound verb. But most often, one or the other will be compound and not both. We've seen then that every sentence can be broken down into two main parts, the subject and the predicate. The subject expresses who or what the sentence is about, and one word from the subject, the simple subject, is the most important word in the subject. The rest of the sentence is the predicate. It tells what the subject is or does, and the most important word in the predicate is the verb. In your study guide, we have an exercise that will give you a chance to practice your understanding of these concepts. In this exercise, your job was to look at each sentence and decide which group of words was the subject and which group of words was the predicate. Then within the subject, you were to identify the most important word, which is the simple subject, and within the predicate, to identify the most important word, which would be the verb. Let's take a look at each of the sentences and see how well you did. First, 53 officers received medals at the police department awards ceremony. What's the subject of this sentence? Who or what is the sentence about? It's the first two words, 53 officers. That is who this sentence is about. And the simple subject, the most important word here, is officers. The other word, 53, gives us more information about the officers. Specifically, it tells us how many officers there were. So 53 officers is the subject, and officers is the simple subject. That means the rest of the sentence would be the predicate. Were you able to identify the single most important word, namely the verb? That's the word that expresses the action that the officers did. The answer to that is received. Received is the verb in this sentence. It tells us what the officers did. They received something. All the rest of the predicate gives us more information about what the officers did. What did they receive? Medals. Where did they receive them? At the police department awards ceremony. So all those other words in the predicate are there to give us more information about the action they did, namely the receiving. Let's take a look at the second sentence. Bored with the grown-up conversation, little Amy fell asleep under the kitchen table. Where would you divide this sentence between the subject and the predicate? In this case, the subject includes all the words up to little Amy. So the subject would include bored with the grown-up conversation, little Amy. All of that is the subject. All of that describes what the sentence is about, or in this case, who the sentence is about. What's the single most important word here? Did you identify one word as the simple subject? The answer is Amy. Amy is the simple subject. That's basically what the sentence is about. All the other words here give us more information about Amy. The other words tell us that Amy is little and that she was bored with the grown-up conversation. So all those other words give more information about the simple subject, Amy. The rest of the sentence is the predicate. Fell asleep under the kitchen table. Which word is the verb, the most important word in the predicate? The answer is fell. What did Amy do? She fell. The rest of the words in the predicate give us more information, specifically that she didn't fall off a ledge or off a sofa, she fell asleep. And where did she fall asleep? Under the kitchen table. So the subject is bored with the grown-up conversation, little Amy, and the predicate is fell asleep under the kitchen table. And fell is the most important word in the predicate, the verb. How about the next example? The number of businesses in this county has increased every year for the past decade. The subject of this sentence is the number of businesses in this county. All of those words go to explain what the sentence is about. Now, picking the simple subject in this sentence isn't so easy. It's a little bit tricky in this case. Is the sentence about businesses or this county? No, it's really about number. The word number is actually the simple subject of this sentence. One way to tell for sure is that that word, that simple subject, is the word that is most directly connected to the predicate. Let's look at the predicate. The predicate is the rest of the sentence, which says, has increased every year for the past decade. Now remember, the predicate tells us what the subject of the sentence does. Now, looking at this sentence, what has increased every year for the past decade? In other words, what does the predicate refer to? What is it that has increased every year for the past decade? Is it the county that has increased? No, the county hasn't increased. Is it businesses has increased? No, not really. What has increased is the number of businesses. In other words, the number was smaller at one time. Now the number is larger. Perhaps the number of businesses was 50. Now it's 100. The point is that the number has increased or gotten larger. So the simple subject here is the word number. It may be difficult to recognize because it's not at the end of the complete subject. It's somewhere buried in the middle, and it's easy to overlook that. But the most important word in this particular subject is the word number, and you can tell that because that's the word that's most directly connected to the predicate. Looking at the predicate, what's the most important word there, or the verb? Once again, this example is a little more tricky than some of the other examples we've seen. In this case, the verb consists of two words. Sometimes verbs in English do consist of two or even more words. In this case, the verb includes both the word has and the word increased. You need both of those words to make the complete verb to explain what the number of businesses in this county has done. The number has increased. You need both of those words to make up the verb. Notice that this is not a compound verb because these are not two separate verbs, two separate actions joined by the word and or. Instead, these are simply two words that fit together to make a single verb describing a single action, has increased. It simply happens to be a verb that is made up of two words rather than just one. So in this case, the verb is has increased. And those two words together make up the verb, which is the most important word in our predicate. Next example. According to scientists, birds and dinosaurs are biologically related. Where would we divide the subject and the predicate in this case? In this sentence, the subject is everything up through the word dinosaurs. So the subject is, according to scientists, birds and dinosaurs. The rest of the sentence is the predicate. It tells us what the subject is or does. Are biologically related. Now let's go back to the subject. What's the simple subject here? Do you notice anything unusual about it? In this case, we have a compound subject because there are two subjects, both equally important, connected by the word and. Birds and dinosaurs. So those two words together with the word and connecting them make up the simple subject in this particular sentence. Looking at the predicate, what's the most important word, the verb in this predicate? The verb is are. What the sentence is about is something that birds and dinosaurs are. And all the remaining words in the sentence give more information about that. They tell us where this information comes from, namely scientists, and they tell us what the birds and dinosaurs are. They are biologically related. Our last example, all day and all night unceasingly fell the rain. This sentence may sound a little bit unusual to you, and it's written in a slightly unusual English style. It almost sounds a little bit poetic, and we put it in for a specific reason. Where would you find the subject in this particular sentence? Well, this sentence is different from all the other sentences we've looked at so far because the subject is at the end of the sentence. In most English sentences, the subject comes at the beginning. But once in a while, you'll encounter an English sentence where the subject comes at the end, and often it has a slightly unusual sound, as this sentence does. In this case, when we ask who or what is the sentence about, we say it's about the rain. So those last two words of the sentence, the rain, are the subject. And the simple subject is the one word, rain. The rest of the sentence is the predicate. It tells what the rain did. And what did the rain do? All day and all night unceasingly fell. What's the single most important word in the predicate? The verb, which tells us exactly what the rain did. The verb is fell. So the heart of this sentence is rain fell, and all the other words give us a little more information about that. Obviously, we threw this sentence into the mix to illustrate for you that the subject isn't always at the beginning of the sentence, but in most English sentences it is. So when you're looking for the subject of a sentence, start by looking at the beginning. The chances are good that that's where it is. But if you don't find it there, stop and think, perhaps this is one of those unusual sentences where the subject appears at the end. And this is an example of that. So far in this program, we've been talking about sentences. Now I'm about to introduce a new word for a reason which will soon become apparent. This new word is clause. And here's the definition. A clause is a group of words that includes both a subject and a verb. Now you may be thinking, gee, that sounds an awful lot like a sentence, because after all the sentences we've looked at up to this point do contain both subjects and verbs. So how is a clause different from a sentence? Well, that will become obvious in a moment. Let me explain that there are two kinds of clauses. One of them is the same as a sentence, and the other is not. But it's important to understand both kinds of clauses because larger and more complicated sentence structures may involve both kinds of clauses. Here's how it works. The first kind of clause is an independent clause. An independent clause is one that can stand alone as a sentence. Why? Because it expresses a complete thought. You know the word independent means able to stand on one's own. When the United States became independent from the country that founded it, England, the United States was able to stand on its own. And an independent clause can stand on its own as a sentence. Take a look at this example. Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter. Now, this is a clause because it's a group of words that contains both a subject and a verb. Can you identify the subject and the verb in this sentence? The subject is Europa. Europa is what the sentence is about. The verb is. That is what Europa is or does in this sentence. It is something. And the rest of the words tell us what Europa is, one of the moons of Jupiter. So this is a clause because it contains both a subject and a verb. It's also a sentence because this happens to be an independent clause, a clause that is able to stand alone as a sentence because it expresses a complete thought. Well, if an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, what do you call a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence? The answer is a subordinate clause. The word subordinate means following or less important than, and this describes what these clauses are like. A subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence because it doesn't express a complete thought. Usually, subordinate clauses begin with particular types of words which are known as subordinating conjunctions. A conjunction is a word that connects two groups of words, and the word subordinating means making something less important. So a subordinating conjunction is a word that connects the subordinate clause to the rest of the sentence and makes the subordinate clause less important. Because the subordinating conjunction is present, the subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence. Here are some examples of subordinating conjunctions: if, after, because, since, although, when, until. Normally, a clause that begins with one of these words, one of these subordinating conjunctions, can't stand alone as a sentence because it won't express a complete thought. Therefore, we consider it a subordinate clause. Take a look at this example. Because Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. Now, this is a clause because it does contain a subject and a verb. The subject is Europa. The verb is has. So far, so good. But can this stand alone as a sentence? No. I think if you listen to this group of words, you can see that the clause doesn't express a complete thought. It says, because Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. This leaves you wondering what the speaker is getting at. Because Europa has oceans filled with water, therefore what? We're waiting for some conclusion. It sounds as though the sentence is leading to some conclusion, but none is presented. And therefore, this isn't a complete sentence. Rather, it's a subordinate clause, one that cannot stand alone as a sentence. And if this were to appear in a piece of writing as if it were a complete sentence, that would be a mistake. This is really a sentence fragment. This is a subordinate clause because it begins with the subordinating conjunction because. Notice that having the subordinating conjunction because there makes this into a subordinate clause. If you were to take away that subordinating conjunction, the sentence would become an independent clause. It could stand alone as a sentence. The sentence would then say, Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. Now that sounds like a complete thought. But when you put the subordinating conjunction because in front of it, it makes the clause less important. It makes it feel as though it needs to be attached to something else in order to express a complete thought. So this is the second type of clause. An independent clause can stand alone as a sentence. A subordinate clause cannot. And a subordinate clause usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. Now, why is it important to know about subordinate clauses? Because subordinate clauses are an important building block in many sentences. In fact, there are 4 different kinds of sentence structures that you need to know about, and subordinate clauses are important in some of them. The 4 types of sentence structures that you need to understand are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. Let's take a look at each. First, a simple sentence. A simple sentence consists of one independent clause. Remember, an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, and when it does, the result is what we call a simple sentence. For example, life may exist on Europa. This simple sentence contains the subject, life, the verb, which has 2 words, may exist, and taken together it is one clause, one independent clause, and therefore a simple sentence. By contrast, a compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses, which are joined either by a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. That's a complicated definition, so let's take it piece by piece. A compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses. As we've seen, an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, but 2 of them can also be joined together to form a compound sentence. Now, when you have 2 independent clauses and you want to join them together, you have to do it according to certain rules. And there are basically 2 alternatives, 2 ways of making that connection. One way of making the connection is by using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. There are a few different words that are called coordinating conjunctions. The most important and common ones are and, or, and but. So one way of joining two independent clauses to create a compound sentence is by using a comma and the word and, or but. Another way of connecting two independent clauses to make a compound sentence is by using a semicolon in between them. Let's take a look at an example of a compound sentence. Many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life, but others disagree. Here we have two independent clauses which have been joined together to form a single compound sentence. The first independent clause is, many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life. The word extraterrestrial means life outside of this planet, outside of the Earth. That could stand alone as a sentence. It's an independent clause. It contains the subject, astronomers, and the verb believe, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Then we have the clause, but others disagree. That could also stand alone as a sentence. It contains the subject others, the verb disagree, and the word but tells you that there's a contrast to the preceding idea. Nonetheless, it could stand alone as a sentence. It's perfectly all right to begin a sentence with a word like but or and. In any case, this is another independent clause. So this could have been set up as two separate sentences. But because the ideas are closely connected, the writer wanted to link them. How did he do it? By using a comma and the coordinating conjunction but. Putting that comma and the word but in there makes it easy to connect the two clauses to form one sentence, namely a compound sentence, because it's made up of two independent clauses. Now remember, we said there's another way of creating a compound sentence, and that is to use a semicolon in place of the comma and the coordinating conjunction. So this sentence would also be correct if it read as follows. Many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life, semicolon, others disagree. This would also be a correct way of creating this compound sentence. The point, a compound sentence consists of two independent clauses, and there are two alternative ways of joining them to make a single sentence. So that's our second type of sentence, simple sentence and a compound sentence. Now for the third type. A complex sentence contains an independent clause and one or more subordinate clauses. Now remember, the subordinate clause cannot stand alone as a sentence. However, it works perfectly well when it is attached to an independent clause. It normally has a secondary or less important meaning, and it needs the independent clause in order to express a complete thought. Let's take a look at an example of how this works. Here's a sentence. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered, it will change human history. Now here we have two clauses. The first clause says, if extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. The subject of this clause is life. The verb is discovered. It's a two-word verb, and in this case, the word ever happens to come in between the two parts of the verb. That happens sometimes. So the subject and the verb is life is discovered, and the whole clause reads, if extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. Now let's pause. Is that an independent clause or a subordinate clause? Could it stand alone as a sentence? Well, think about how it sounds. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. Doesn't it leave you hanging? It leaves you wondering what the author is building toward. It sounds as though some conclusion is necessary. Therefore, we don't have a complete thought. We do have a subordinate clause. This is a clause that can't stand alone as a sentence. Let's take a look at the other clause and see what that is like. The other clause reads, it will change human history. This is a clause because it contains a subject and a verb. The subject is it, and will change is the verb. It will change human history. Now, could this clause stand alone as a sentence? Yes, it could. It expresses a complete thought. It will change human history. That could be a sentence by itself. So this is an independent clause. In this case, therefore, we have a subordinate clause first, followed by an independent clause, the two things work together to create a single complete thought. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered, it will change human history. The first clause sets up a possibility, and the second clause explains what would happen if that possibility comes true. So the two clauses work together to express one complete idea. And therefore we have a correct sentence which is known as a complex sentence, because that's what a complex sentence does. It combines two different kinds of clauses, one an independent clause and the other a subordinate clause, makes them into a whole to express a single thought. Notice that it doesn't matter what order the clauses are in. The subordinate clause could come first, or the independent clause could come first. In this particular sentence, the subordinate clause comes first, but it could have been the other way around. Either way, it's considered a complex sentence. The fourth and most difficult kind of sentence is known as the compound complex sentence. The compound complex sentence contains two or more independent clauses and one or more subordinate clauses. So it's like a combination of the compound sentence with the complex sentence. As you can see, the compound complex sentence must have at least three clauses. And some writers in English, William Faulkner is a famous novelist who is a good example of this. Some writers in English write sentences that go on for many, many words, and in some cases, even a page or more. And some of the sentences in William Faulkner contain 10 or 12 or more separate clauses. Those are very complicated sentences, and their grammar is very difficult to untangle. But a compound complex sentence must contain at least three clauses. Let's take a look at an example, and we'll see how this works. Although no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found, the search continues, and many predict success. In this sentence, we have three groups of words, and each of these three is a clause, because each contains a subject and a verb. Let's take a look at each one. The first group of words says, although no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found. This is a clause because it contains a subject and a verb. The verb actually happens to be three words long. Has been found is the complete verb. You need all three words to make up the verb in this case. The word yet, which is stuck in the middle, happens to be an adverb. And adverbs do sometimes interrupt verbs in this way. But that isn't an important detail for right now. The verb is has been found, and the subject is sign. Sign has been found is the heart of this clause. Now, looking at the clause as a whole, is it an independent clause or a subordinate clause? Could it stand alone as a sentence? Well, the answer is no, it couldn't. Read it again. Although no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found. Perhaps you can hear that something is missing. The author seems to be building up to some conclusion, but no conclusion is presented. We can't tell what is supposed to happen as a result of the fact that no sign of life on other worlds has yet been found. We feel as though we're left hanging. Therefore, this clause doesn't express a complete thought, so it's a subordinate clause. The telltale sign, of course, is that it begins with a subordinating conjunction, although. Almost always, a clause that begins with the word although will be a subordinate clause and unable to stand alone as a sentence. What about the second clause? The next group of words in the sentence reads, the search continues. Here again we have a subject and a verb. The verb is continues, and the subject is search. Could this stand alone as a sentence? Yes, it could. It expresses a complete thought. It sounds complete. And although it only consists of three words, nonetheless, it would make up a complete sentence by itself and could stand alone. The search continues. So here we have an independent clause. What about the last group of words in the sentence? And many predict success. Once again, this is a clause because it has a subject and a verb. The verb is predict, and the subject is many. Could this stand alone as a sentence? And many predict success. Yes, it could. This expresses a complete thought, and it could stand alone as a sentence. So now let's step back and look at what we have. we have a sentence consisting of three clauses. The first one is a subordinate clause, the second one is an independent clause, and the third one is another independent clause. That's what makes this a compound complex sentence. Notice that the sentence is not terribly long or terribly complicated to understand. You probably didn't find it very difficult to understand what was being said in the sentence. Nonetheless, this is about as complicated from a grammatical standpoint as a sentence can get. Of the four types of sentences, the compound complex sentence is the most complicated type. So if you understand how this sentence is put together, you have a pretty good chance of understanding how any and all sentences are put together. The only difference when you get to a sentence written by someone like William Faulkner is that more and more clauses are piled on, but it just continues to be more of the same kind of thing, more of a compound complex sentence with more and more independent and subordinate clauses added on. Notice that as we've discussed these four types of sentences, the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence, we've seen certain rules that apply to your own writing and to any academic work that you do related to English or grammar. We've seen that it's a mistake to let a subordinate clause stand alone as a sentence. When you do that, you create a sentence fragment, which is considered a grammatical error. Here's another type of grammatical error to watch out for. It's called the run-on sentence. Now, what is a run-on sentence? Many people think from the name of this error that a run-on sentence is a sentence that is simply too long. Perhaps they figure that a sentence that's more than 50 words, let's say, is a run-on sentence. Well, a run-on sentence really has nothing to do with the length. There's a very simple definition of a run-on sentence, which should make it easy for you to avoid it in your own writing. A run-on sentence includes two or more independent clauses that are joined only by a comma or by nothing at all. Now let's stop and remember how we defined a compound sentence. Remember, a compound sentence contains two or more independent clauses. But when we discussed the compound sentence, we saw that there were two appropriate ways of connecting the two independent clauses. One way would be to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction, such as and, or but. The other correct way would be to use a semicolon. A run-on sentence comes about when two independent clauses are taken and simply jammed together with no punctuation between them, or perhaps just a comma. Doing that makes an incorrect sentence. It's a run-on. The connection between the two independent clauses is not clear, and it's considered a grammatical error. So if you have a teacher who says, you've made a mistake in your paper by writing a run-on sentence, this is what the teacher means. And you can see that the way to correct it is by following the proper rules for creating a compound sentence. Here's an example of a run-on sentence. Visit the City Science Museum. You'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. Here we have two clauses. Visit the City Science Museum. That's an independent clause, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Then we have another clause. You'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. What's the subject and the verb in each of these clauses, by the way? The first clause may be a little bit tricky. It has a verb, visit, but the subject doesn't appear. This is an imperative clause, namely one that is giving you an order or a recommendation or a suggestion. And the subject doesn't appear normally in an imperative sentence. The subject is understood to be you. What this clause is saying is you visit the City Science Museum. So an imperative sentence is an exception to our rule that a subject and a verb must always appear. In an imperative sentence, the subject may be understood. In our second clause, the subject is you, and the verb is will see. In this case, it takes the form of the contraction apostrophe LL instead of spelling out the word will at full length. But the words you'll see really mean the same as you will see. So in the second clause here, the verb is will see, and the subject is you. So we have two clauses here, either one of which could stand alone as a sentence. Look at that second clause. You'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. That could stand alone as a sentence. We have two independent clauses which have simply been stuck together with a comma in between. That's what makes this wrong. It's a run-on sentence. If you had written this in your own paper, you would have to correct it to make the paper grammatically acceptable. What would be a good way to fix this run-on sentence? Well, you have at least two options. Remember our rules about how to create a compound sentence. One way to correct this would be to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. And in this case, the coordinating conjunction "and" seems like the natural choice. So the sentence would be correct if it read, visit the City Science Museum, comma, and you'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. Another way to correct the run-on sentence would be to substitute a semicolon for the comma. Then the sentence would read, visit the City Science Museum, semicolon, you'll see some fascinating exhibits about outer space. That would also be correct. There's another program in this series that deals with punctuation, and we'll talk in more detail about the semicolon in that program. But for now, here's an important tip to remember. The purpose of the semicolon, basically, is to connect independent clauses. So whenever you use a semicolon in your writing, what appears on either side of the semicolon should be an independent clause, able to stand alone as a sentence. And if you put a semicolon in the middle of this longer sentence, you would create a correct compound sentence. The problem with it as it now reads is that it's a run-on because the two independent clauses have simply been stuck together with a comma, which does not work. Of course, there's really a third possible solution, which would be to make the two independent clauses into two separate sentences. Put a period in between and put a capital letter at the beginning of the second sentence, and you'd be fine. So a run-on sentence can easily be corrected, but you must remember the rules for properly creating a compound sentence. To reinforce the skills and the topics we've just been discussing, we have one more exercise in your study guide. In this exercise, you were asked to read several sentences, and for each one to decide whether it was a simple sentence, a compound sentence, a complex sentence, or a compound complex sentence. In addition, we threw in one run-on sentence for you to notice. Remember that a run-on sentence is an error, something you would need to correct if you wrote one in your own writing. Let's take a look at the first sentence in the exercise. Jazz is the greatest American musical form, and Duke Ellington is its greatest genius. Here we have two clauses, and both are independent clauses. Either of these could stand alone as a sentence. Jazz is the greatest American musical form. That could stand alone as a sentence. Duke Ellington is its greatest genius. That too could stand alone as an independent sentence. Therefore, we have two independent clauses which have been properly and correctly combined by using a comma and the word "and." Therefore, we have a compound sentence in this case. Let's look at our second example. Although young women want to participate in sports as much as young men, women's sports often don't receive equal funding from colleges. Here we have a slightly longer sentence, but it's still fundamentally not too complicated. It really consists of just two clauses. Let's break it down into parts and analyze each one. The first clause is everything before the comma, and it reads, although young women want to participate in sports as much as young men. What's the verb in this particular clause? What word expresses action or being on the part of the subject? The verb is want, and the subject is women. Young women is the broader subject, but the simple subject is women. So the subject and verb in this clause is women want, and everything else in the clause is there to provide more information about what kind of women we're talking about and what specifically they want. Now, looking at that clause as a whole, could it stand alone as a sentence? The answer is no. It's a subordinate clause. It couldn't stand alone as a sentence. And again, there's a telltale sign. It begins with the subordinating conjunction, although. When you read this clause, you can see that something more is needed to make a complete thought. Although young women want to participate in sports as much as young men, therefore what? We don't know, and so by itself, this would not work as a complete sentence. Notice that although there are a lot of words there, it would still make a sentence fragment. So the word fragment doesn't necessarily mean a short or small number of words. It simply means that the words do not express a complete thought and therefore cannot stand alone as a sentence. So we have here a subordinate clause in the first part of this sentence. What about the second part of the sentence? Women's sports often don't receive equal funding from colleges. Here we have an independent clause. This could stand alone as a complete sentence. Don't receive is the verb, and sports, or women's sports, more broadly, is the subject. This could stand alone as a sentence, so it's an independent clause. So we have here a subordinate clause linked to an independent clause. The two ideas together make one complete thought, and therefore we have a complex sentence. Our third example reads, the tallest mountain in Africa, Mount Kilimanjaro, is the subject of a stunning new IMAX documentary film. Now, the first group of words in this sentence doesn't happen to be a clause. The sentence begins, the tallest mountain in Africa. Remember that a clause has to contain both a subject and a verb. Is there a verb here, a word expressing action or being? Not really. We simply have what could be a subject, the tallest mountain in Africa, but there's no verb there. So this is not a clause. It's a modifying phrase, again, a term that's not important for this conversation, but it's simply giving more information about what appears in the real clause, which is about to begin. Mount Kilimanjaro is the subject of a stunning new IMAX documentary film. Here is where the verb appears. Is the verb, and the simple subject is Mount Kilimanjaro. So in this case, this sentence consists of simply one clause, one independent clause, which is able to stand alone as a sentence. So this is a simple sentence. Again, notice the term simple sentence doesn't necessarily mean that the sentence is very short. There are quite a few words here, but because there's only one clause, it's a simple sentence. Our next example. The author Mark Twain was fascinated by technology. He was the first writer ever to deliver a typed manuscript to his publisher. Here we have two separate clauses, and both of them happen to be independent clauses. Either one could stand alone as a sentence. You can probably tell just by reading them. The author Mark Twain was fascinated by technology. We have a subject and a verb, and this could stand alone as a complete thought. He was the first writer ever to deliver a typed manuscript to his publisher. Here again we have a subject and a verb, and it could stand alone as a complete thought. We have two independent clauses then. Does that mean we have a compound sentence? No, because the rules for how you create a compound sentence have not been followed. The two independent clauses have simply been stuck together with a comma. So what do we have? We have a run-on sentence, and this is an error. It would have to be corrected either by adding a coordinating conjunction, such as and, or but, or by substituting a semicolon for the comma in the middle of the sentence. In this case, using a semicolon would probably make the most sense, since and, or but do not work particularly well as connecting words in this sentence. Instead, using a semicolon to turn this into a proper compound sentence would be a good way of correcting the run-on sentence. It would then read, the author Mark Twain was fascinated by technology, semicolon. He was the first writer ever to deliver a typed manuscript to his publisher. And that would be correct. Our last sentence reads, when I visited California last summer, I spent 1 week in San Francisco, and I visited the nearby Napa Valley with my cousin. Here we have three clauses. The first one, when I visited California last summer, is a subordinate clause. Perhaps you can tell that it can't stand alone as a sentence. It leaves us wondering what happened when I visited California last summer. It sounds incomplete, and it is. It is a subordinate clause and can't stand alone as a sentence. The next clause reads, I spent 1 week in San Francisco. This is an independent clause. It could stand alone as a sentence. The last clause reads, I visited the nearby Napa Valley with my cousin. Again, it's another independent clause, and it could also stand alone as a sentence. So in this case, we have a subordinate clause followed by 2 independent clauses. What kind of sentence does this make? A compound, complex sentence. So this shows exactly how these different types of sentences work. And I think you can see that combining independent with subordinate clauses in various ways gives you the flexibility to bring together in a single sentence ideas that are related to one another or that belong together and that add up to a complete whole. And the more practice you have in writing in English, the better you'll get at using each of these 4 different types of sentences appropriately in order to express increasingly complex ideas. Well, that concludes our discussion of sentence structure. You've learned about the basic parts of any sentence, about the most common types of sentences, and you've also learned about the errors that you need to avoid when constructing a sentence properly in order to earn high grades on papers that you might write for school, as well as to express yourself effectively and correctly in any writing that you do on the job or in any other life situation. I hope you found this program to be helpful, and you're invited to view the other programs in Video-Aided Instructions English Grammar Series in order to further strengthen your comfort level with the complexities of English grammar. Thank you for watching, and good luck in your future endeavors. Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video-Aided Instructions English Grammar Series. This is the Parts of Speech program. Think of a sentence as a kind of machine, a machine for communicating ideas. The machine is made out of parts that are called words. Now, if you were an auto mechanic, you'd have to know about the different kinds of parts that go to make up a car. The transmission, the carburetor, the ignition, the radiator, and so on. A car has to contain the right parts, properly installed and well maintained if it's to run. In the same way, a person who wants to communicate effectively must understand the different kinds of words that go to make up a sentence. These different kinds of words are called parts of speech. If you understand the parts of speech and how they fit together to make up a sentence, you'll understand how words are assembled to create sentences, and you'll be able to do so correctly and effectively. In this program, we're going to go through each of the different parts of speech and see how they work together to form English sentences. There are 9 different parts of speech in English. That is, 9 different kinds of words that are used in creating sentences. In this first lesson, we'll talk about 3 of the parts of speech: verbs, nouns, and pronouns. Let's begin with verbs. As you recall, every sentence in English can be divided into 2 main parts, the subject and the predicate. The subject is what the sentence is about. The predicate tells something that the subject is or does. And within the predicate, the single most important word is the verb. A verb expresses action done by or to the subject, or it expresses a state of being of the subject. As you can see, the verb is always closely related to the subject. It tells either what the subject is or what the subject does. As you can imagine, there are many different kinds of verbs because verbs express all kinds of actions, activities, or states of being on the part of the subject. Here are some examples of typical verbs: go, decorate, believe, is, appears. Let's look at each of these examples. Perhaps you can come up with a sentence in which each of these words would be used as a verb. Let's start with the first one, go. Can you come up with a sentence that uses the verb go? How about this one? I go to school every day. Here, the verb go is expressing an action being done by the subject, I. It tells something that I, the subject, do. How about our second example, decorate? Can you come up with a sentence including that verb? Here's one. Every spring, we decorate the gym for our annual dance. Here, the verb decorate expresses an action being done by the subject, we. It tells something that we do. We decorate. How about the verb believe? I believe it's going to rain today. Here, the verb believe is expressing an action being done by the subject, I. Notice that in this case, the action is completely internal. It's a mental action, which means it's something that other people can't see happening. Nonetheless, it is an action. So the verb believe is expressing an action in that sentence. How about the verb is? Can you come up with a sentence that uses the verb is? The weather is cloudy today. Here, the verb is linked with the subject weather. Is it expressing an action or a state of being? The verb is expresses a state of being. It isn't telling us something that the weather is doing. Instead, it's telling us something that the weather is. It is cloudy today. How about our last example, appears? Is this verb a verb that expresses an action or a state of being? Well, the verb appears is an interesting example because it can do either one. In some sentences, the verb appears expresses an action. In other sentences, it expresses a state of being. Let's consider a couple of examples. Susan appears on television as a singer. In that sentence, the verb appears is expressing an action being done by the subject, Susan. It tells us something that Susan does. She appears on television. In that sentence, therefore, appears expresses an action. In other sentences, however, appears might express a state of being. For example, the weather appears cloudy. In that sentence, the verb appears is expressing a state of being. It is telling us something that the weather is, not something the weather is doing. When we say the weather appears cloudy, we mean more or less the same as the weather is cloudy. So a verb like appears can be either a verb expressing an action or a state of being. And there are a few verbs like that in English which can go either way. They can express a state of being or an action. Notice one other thing about verbs. Verbs may contain more than one word. When a verb consists of two or more words, it's called a verb phrase, and it's made up of a main verb and one or more helping verbs. Here are a few examples of verb phrases. Had gone, will decorate, must believe, should have been, and may appear. In each of these phrases, the main verb comes last, and one or more helping verbs have been added on to modify or give further meaning to the main verb. And in each case, the helping verbs somewhat change the meaning of the main verb. For example, they may change the time in which the action is occurring. Take, for example, the verb phrase, will decorate. When I say, we decorate the gym every year, we're talking about something that's happening now. But when we say we will decorate the gym next year, we're talking about something happening in the future. So the helping verb will changes the meaning of the main verb by expressing a particular time when the event will take place. When verbs are modified or changed in this way to influence or to express the time when the action will take place, then we're talking about creating different verb tenses. Verb tenses are used to express the time when an action or a state of being takes place. The whole subject of verb tenses and of properly using verbs is fairly complicated. In fact, it's so complicated that we've devoted an entire program to that subject. And if you're interested in learning more about how to use verbs properly, we recommend you watch that program. Let's move on to the second important part of speech, nouns. A noun names a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. Here are some examples of nouns. Student, Barbara, state, Cleveland, sofa, freedom. All of these are nouns because they name a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. Let's look at each example. What about student? What does that name? Well, that names a person, or at least a kind of person. How about Barbara? That names a person, and it names a specific person. We'll talk in a moment about the special kind of noun that Barbara represents. What about state? What does that name? Well, that names a place. A state would be one of the 50 states that goes to make up the United States, and it's a place where you might live. Cleveland also names a place. Again, a very specific place, a particular city within the United States. Sofa names a thing, and freedom names an idea. Sofa and freedom are both nouns, but notice that one of them names something that you can lay your hands on, something that you can see, something that you can perceive with your senses. That's sofa. Freedom, however, names something that's much more difficult to grasp. It's not something you can see with your eyes or touch with your hands. Freedom is an idea. It's an important concept that many people think about a lot, but it's not something you can point to or perceive with your senses. And that's another example of a kind of noun, a noun that names an idea. Now, within the broad category of nouns, there are two particular types of nouns that you need to be aware of. These are a common noun and a proper noun. A common noun names a category of people, places, things, or ideas. A proper noun names a specific example. A proper noun normally begins with a capital letter. Therefore, it's important to recognize the difference between a common noun and a proper noun, since when you're writing them, you need to know whether to use a capital letter or not. We've already seen a couple of examples of proper nouns. Barbara, a moment ago, is an example of a proper noun. Why? Because it names a specific example of a person, rather than a category of people, like student. That's why when the name Barbara is used in a written sentence, it would begin with a capital letter. In the same way, Cleveland is a proper noun. It names a specific example of a city rather than the broad general category of cities, so that the noun city would be a common noun, whereas Cleveland, which names a specific city, would be a proper noun. And that's why Cleveland would begin with a capital C when you were writing a sentence using the word Cleveland. Here are a couple of other examples to help you see the difference. The word month is a common noun because it describes a category of things. All the different months would fit into the category of month. May, however, would be a proper noun because it names a specific month of the year, the 5th month of the year in the Western calendar. One more example. The noun ocean is a common noun. It describes a general category of things. Large bodies of water are called oceans, and all the oceans in the world fit into that category. The word Atlantic is a proper noun. It names a specific example of an ocean, one particular ocean that's found in a certain place on the map. It's a vast place, of course, but nonetheless, it's one and only one ocean. So Atlantic is a proper noun and would always be written with a capital A. One other thing to know about nouns is that nouns may be singular or plural. In English, we draw these two distinctions between a singular noun, which refers to one and only one thing, person, place, or idea, and a plural noun, which refers to a number of people, places, things, or ideas. Two or more would be plural. In English, most plural nouns are formed simply by adding the letter S to the end of the singular noun. So, for example, the common noun a sofa would be made plural simply by adding an S at the end and turning it into sofas. If you have one sofa in your living room, you would spell it S-O-F-A. If you have two sofas or more, you would add an S at the end, and the word becomes sofas, which is plural for sofa. There are a few nouns that change their form from singular to plural in a slightly different way. Some, for example, don't end in the letter S at all. The common noun man becomes men in the plural. Similarly, woman becomes women in the plural, and child becomes children in the plural. Some other words do add an S at the end, but also change their spelling in some other way when they move from singular to plural. So, for example, the noun leaf, which is singular, becomes leaves in the plural. The F turns into VE, and then the S is added as well. When you learn a new noun, perhaps by looking it up in the dictionary, make a note of how the plural is formed. And in particular, if the plural is formed in an unusual way, make a note of it so that you'll be able to spell it correctly the next time you use the word in a sentence. The third important part of speech is pronouns. A pronoun is a word that takes the place of a noun or a group of nouns. Here are some examples of pronouns: he, she, it, we, they, some, any, who, which, someone. There are many more examples of pronouns and various kinds of pronouns. Again, pronouns are a complicated subject, and we've devoted an entire program in this series to learning all about pronouns and how to use them correctly. So in this program, we're going to speak briefly about pronouns and explain some of the basics that you need to understand. We say that a pronoun takes the place of a noun or a group of nouns. Now, why would you want to use a pronoun in place of a noun or a group of nouns? The basic reason is to avoid unnecessary repetition. Suppose you were writing a story about someone named Mark, and Mark did a number of things in the story. It might get rather tiring to keep referring to Mark by name. Mark went for a walk. Mark walked in the park. Mark saw birds. Mark saw trees. Mark decided to go for lunch, and so on and so forth. By the time you finished reading one page of that story, the reader would be tired of hearing the name Mark repeated over and over and over again. Therefore, pronouns were invented to provide a little relief and a little variety. The second time you refer to Mark in that story, you don't have to use the noun Mark. Instead, you can substitute the pronoun he, or in other contexts, a pronoun like his or him. So, for example, your story about Mark could talk about Mark going for a walk and then saying he decided to have lunch. He went with his brother, and they enjoyed lunch together. By using the pronouns he and his and they, the same nouns don't have to be repeated over and over again. The sentence becomes a little more enjoyable and interesting to read, and you don't have the boring repetition of the noun over and over again. So pronouns were invented basically as a way of adding greater variety to writing and making it unnecessary to keep repeating the same nouns over and over again. As you can see, a pronoun always refers back to some noun, or in some cases, a group of nouns. And it's important that the connection between the pronoun and the noun or nouns to which the pronoun refers be very clear. The word or words that a pronoun refers to is called the antecedent of the pronoun. Here are a couple of examples of how an antecedent works. Angela quickly ate her lunch. What pronoun do you notice in this sentence? The pronoun is her. Now, what noun does the pronoun her refer to? Or what noun does the pronoun her take the place of? It refers back to Angela. It takes the place of Angela because in writing this sentence, the author could have repeated that noun Angela. The sentence could have said, Angela quickly ate Angela's lunch. But that sounds a little awkward and repetitious, doesn't it? So instead, the writer substituted the pronoun her for the noun Angela's and wrote, Angela quickly ate her lunch. That means that the antecedent of the pronoun her is Angela. Angela is the noun to which the pronoun her refers. And you'll notice that the two match in the following way. Is Angela a male or a female? Well, in English-speaking countries, the name Angela is normally used for a female, a woman, or a girl. And that's why the pronoun her has been used, because the pronoun her is also female. It refers to a woman or a girl. So the pronoun and the antecedent in this case have to match in terms of gender, that is, in terms of male or female. And in the special program All About Pronouns, we'll talk more about the importance of making sure that a pronoun and its antecedent match in various ways. Gender is one of the ways in which the pronoun and its antecedent have to match. Here's another example. Jeremy asked Paul to give him a ride. What's the pronoun in this sentence? Here the pronoun is him. Now, can you tell what noun him substitutes for or refers back to? In this case, the pronoun him refers back to Jeremy. We can tell by reading this sentence that Jeremy is asking Paul to give Jeremy a ride. That's the logical interpretation of the meaning of the sentence. So the pronoun him refers back to an antecedent, Jeremy. It's always important when you use a pronoun to be sure that you're clear as to what the antecedent is, so you can make sure that the meaning of the sentence is clear, and so that you can make sure that the pronoun and its antecedent match in every way that's important, including gender. In these two sentences, the pronoun does match the antecedent, and therefore the pronoun is correctly used. In your study guide, we've provided an exercise to test and reinforce the information you've learned in this lesson. Please turn to your study guide and try your hand at that first exercise. In this exercise, your job was to read 5 sentences and, in each one, identify the nouns, the verbs, and the pronouns used. Let's see how well you were able to carry out this assignment. Let's look at the first sentence. When Nicole read the letter, she realized that she must change the plans for her vacation. Let's begin with the nouns. How many nouns did you identify in this sentence? This sentence actually contains 4 different nouns. The nouns are Nicole, letter, plans, and vacation. One of these nouns is a proper noun. That's why it begins with a capital letter, and that's the noun Nicole. It's a proper noun because it names a specific individual. All the other nouns in this sentence are common nouns. They name categories of things, and that's why they don't have to begin with capital letters. Notice that plans, the third noun given in this sentence, is a plural noun. It refers to more than one plan. The other nouns here are all singular, letter and vacation. What about verbs? How many verbs did you find in this sentence? There are actually 3 different verbs: read, realized, and must change. Remember, some verbs are verb phrases. They consist of more than one word. The verb must change is a verb phrase. It includes the main verb, change, and the helping verb, must. Finally, pronouns. How many pronouns did you recognize in this sentence? There are 3 pronouns: she, and her. All 3 of these pronouns have the same antecedent. They all refer back to the same noun, namely Nicole. You could rewrite this sentence to substitute the proper noun Nicole for each of those pronouns. The sentence wouldn't read very well then, but the meaning would still be the same. When Nicole read the letter, Nicole realized that Nicole must change the plans for Nicole's vacation. That sounds silly, and no one would ever write or speak that way. But that shows you how pronouns refer back to antecedents. They take the place of nouns. Did you get all of those answers correct? I hope so. Let's take a look at the second sentence. Henry Ford created the Model T, which was for many years the most popular car in the world. Let's begin with nouns. There are several nouns in this sentence. The first is Henry Ford. That's a proper noun because it names a particular person, and both parts of this noun, Henry and Ford, begin with capital letters. Model T is another proper noun. It also names a particular type of car, a particular type of vehicle, and therefore model and T both begin with a capital letter as well. Years, car, and world are also nouns. Those three also name general categories of things, and these are common nouns. That's why they don't begin with capital letters. What about verbs? How many verbs did you notice in this sentence? There are two of them, created and was. And what about pronouns? Did you notice any pronouns in this sentence? This is a little bit tricky. The one pronoun that's in this sentence is the pronoun which. That's a different kind of pronoun than the pronouns we saw in our first sentence, which referred back to Nicole. In this case, the pronoun which is a special kind of pronoun known as a relative pronoun. It's not important for you to remember the term right now, but generally speaking, relative pronouns are used to connect one clause or one part of the sentence to another. And in this case, you can see that the relative pronoun which connects the first and the second parts of this sentence together. The pronoun which refers back to Model T. The Model T was for many years the most popular car in the world. So a relative pronoun does have an antecedent, just like the personal pronouns that we saw in the previous sentence. Again, it's not important right now to learn the names of the different types of pronouns, but it's good to recognize that a word like which acts more or less the same way as a noun, but which takes the place of a noun, is in fact a pronoun, just as she or he are pronouns. Let's look at the third sentence. Is anyone in your class interested in attending next week's seminar on Italian painting? Again, let's begin with nouns. Which nouns did you recognize in this sentence? The nouns here are class, weeks, seminar, and painting. You might be curious about the second noun here, weeks, which ends with an apostrophe S. The apostrophe S is usually used in English to turn a noun into a possessive noun, and you use the possessive form of the noun when describing something that belongs to or is related to the noun. In this case, the seminar belongs to next week or is related to next week. Next week is when that seminar is going to be held. So you can refer to that in English as next week's seminar and use the possessive form of the noun week. It remains a noun, it simply takes on a slightly different form by adding the apostrophe S to turn it into the possessive form. So those are the nouns that appear in this sentence. What about verbs? Which verbs did you notice? Well, there's one verb in this sentence, and it's a slightly tricky one. The verb is a verb phrase, is interested. Notice that the words that make up a verb phrase can sometimes be separated by other words. One of the times when the words in a verb phrase are separated by other words is in a question like this. This particular sentence is asking a question. It's an interrogative sentence. And in an interrogative sentence, most often, the order of the words is a little different than in the most common declarative sentence. And one of the things that often happens is that the words in a verb phrase are separated by other words. Imagine if you were to change this sentence into a declarative sentence, making a statement rather than asking a question. You would probably bring the words of the verb phrase back together. You would say something like, anyone is interested in attending next week's seminar. And the two words of the verb phrase, is interested, would now be reunited. But to turn it into a question, we break them up in the order in which we've shown in this sentence. So, is interested is the verb phrase, interested is the main verb, is the helping verb. What is the subject of the verb is interested? It's the pronoun anyone. And this particular sentence, in fact, contains two different pronouns, anyone and your. We've already said that there are many different types of pronouns. Pronouns act like nouns, but they take the place of nouns. The pronoun anyone is from a class of pronouns known as indefinite pronouns. And they're called indefinite pronouns because they refer to one or more nouns that are indefinite, that are not specifically stated. Who or what is anyone? Well, we really don't know. The antecedent of the pronoun anyone is not definite. The person who is asking this question, the person who is stating this sentence, is referring to some unknown person in your class who might be interested in next week's seminar. Since the person is unknown, that person is referred to using an indefinite pronoun, anyone. Other examples of indefinite pronouns are someone and no one. All of these refer to people who are not specifically named, and that's why they're called indefinite pronouns. And finally, your is also a pronoun. And here, the antecedent doesn't appear in the same sentence. The antecedent, that is, the person to whom your is referring, is you. It's not exactly stated in the sentence, but it's something that's understood. When you or your are used as pronouns in sentences, the person who's being referred to is you, the listener, the person who is hearing the sentence, or the person to whom the sentence is addressed. So here we have a couple of pronouns being used in slightly unusual ways. We have the indefinite pronoun anyone, and the pronoun your being used to refer to you, the person hearing the sentence. Let's look at our fourth example. Tim bought several beautiful rugs while he was traveling in Turkey. Again, let's begin with the nouns. How many nouns did you recognize here? Well, there are three. Two proper nouns, Tim and Turkey, and one common noun, rugs. How about verbs? How many of those did you recognize here? There are two. One is a single word, bought, which describes something that Tim did, and the other verb phrase was traveling, describes something else that Tim did. Finally, what about pronouns? Did you notice any pronouns here? There's one, the pronoun he. And what's the antecedent of he? To whom does he refer? What is the noun that he takes the place of? The antecedent of he is Tim. The sentence could be rewritten and substitute Tim for he. But again, it would be less interesting and a little more awkward and rather repetitious, which is why the pronoun is used instead. Let's look at our last sentence. When you are designing a bridge, safety is the most important consideration. What nouns did you notice in this sentence? There are three nouns, bridge, safety, and consideration. Notice that bridge describes a thing, while safety and consideration describe ideas. Nouns very often refer to concrete physical things, things that can be seen or perceived with the senses, but remember that nouns can also refer to ideas. And safety and consideration are both ideas. They're things that you can't see or lay your hands on. No one can point to or touch something like safety. Instead, it's an idea in the mind, but it is used in the same ways as any other noun. For example, it's used as the subject of a verb. So that's how we recognize that safety and consideration are nouns, even though they don't describe concrete things the way most nouns do. What about verbs? What verbs did you notice in this sentence? There are two verbs. Are designing is a verb phrase, and is another verb. Are designing, of course, describes an action being taken by you, the subject of the verb. Is describes a state of being that affects the subject of that particular verb, which is safety. And finally, pronouns. Are there any pronouns in this sentence? You is the only pronoun, and once again, its antecedent, the thing it refers to, is you, the person who is hearing the sentence. How many of these identifications did you get right? I hope most or all of them. If you're ready now, let's move on to Lesson 2. In this lesson, we'll talk about three more parts of speech: adjectives, adverbs, and articles. These three types of parts of speech have more in common than beginning with the letter A. All three are modifiers. In grammar, the word modify is used in a special way. To modify something is to change it. Adjectives, adverbs, and articles all modify other words by giving more information about them. Let me explain how this works. Let's start with adjectives. An adjective modifies a noun or pronoun. That is, when an adjective is used in a sentence, it gives more information about or gives further explanation about some noun or pronoun that appears in the sentence. Here are some examples of adjectives: large, unusual, green, impossible. Each of these words, if they were used in a sentence, would give more information about a noun or pronoun that appears somewhere in the sentence. They give more information, and therefore we say they modify the noun or pronoun. For example, if I were writing a sentence about a boat, that word boat would be a noun. If I described it as a large boat, the adjective large would be modifying the noun boat and would be giving us more information about the boat. It would be telling us something about what kind of boat it is. In the same way, the adjective unusual would give more information about the noun hat in a phrase like that unusual hat. The green tree, the adjective green gives more information about the tree. And an impossible task, the adjective impossible gives more information about or explains something more about the noun task. Now, in each of the phrases that I've just used as an example, the adjective comes before the noun. And in the English language, that's usually where adjectives go. However, adjectives can also be used in another way in sentences. The adjective can come after a verb of being, and the verb of being would then link the adjective to the noun, which is the subject of the verb. So, for example, rather than referring to that impossible task in a phrase like that, I could say, this task is impossible. Now, the noun task is the subject of the verb of being, is. And what comes after the verb of being is the adjective impossible. So you can see that in that sentence, the verb of being is links the noun task and the adjective impossible and shows that the two belong together. So an adjective most often comes before a noun in a sentence in English, but it can also come after a verb of being, which links the adjective to the noun or pronoun to which it refers. So look for adjectives in both of those places. Now, sometimes a word which is usually used as a noun or pronoun can be used in a sentence as an adjective. That is, it can be used in such a way as to modify a noun or pronoun, or to give more information about that noun or pronoun. Let me show you a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. Look at this sentence. I like to watch baseball. Now, in that sentence, the word baseball is a noun. It's a thing, an activity that I like to watch. I guess you might describe it as an idea that's being named by the noun, baseball. However, now look at the same word baseball in this sentence. Willie Mays was a great baseball player. How is the word baseball being used in this sentence? Well, in this case, the word baseball is not being used as a noun. It's not describing a thing that I like to watch or that Willie Mays did. Instead, it's being used as an adjective to give more information about a noun that appears elsewhere in the sentence. The noun is player. Willie Mays was a player. What kind of player was he? Well, there are actually two adjectives here that give more information about what kind of player Willie Mays was. He was a baseball player, and he was a great player. So those two adjectives, great and baseball, are being used to modify or give more information about the noun player. Player is a word describing a kind of person. It's a noun. And great and baseball are both being used as adjectives in this sentence. So the same word baseball, which was a noun in our previous sentence, is being used as an adjective here. And that's quite common in English. Speakers of English like to take words and move them around to different parts of speech. And as long as the meaning is clear, there's nothing wrong with that. Here's an example of how a pronoun can be used as an adjective. Which is your favorite sport? In this sentence, which is a pronoun. It happens to be an interrogative pronoun. It's a particular use of pronouns. And again, in our special program about pronouns, we'll talk about the various kinds of pronouns, including interrogative pronouns. But now look at the same word which in this sentence. Which sport do you enjoy the most? In this sentence, the same word which is being used as an adjective. It describes, modifies, adds information about the noun that follows, sport. It tells us that we're referring to a particular sport, namely the sport that you enjoy the most. So the same word which is used as a pronoun in one sentence, can be used as an adjective in another sentence. It all depends on how the word is used, and in this case, because you can see that it modifies the noun that follows, you can tell it's being used as an adjective rather than as a pronoun. One particular type of adjective is important enough to be considered a separate part of speech, and these are articles. An article introduces a noun, and in English there are just three articles, a, an, and the. The is called the definite article because when it's used, it states that the noun that follows is one specific noun as opposed to any example from the category. A and an are indefinite articles because when they are used, they are referring to any example from within the category. So, for example, if I say, gee, I would like an apple for lunch, I'm not specifying any specific apple. I'm just saying any old apple would be great for my lunch. If I say, I would like the apple for lunch, I'm referring to the one apple that I see on the counter in front of me right now. So that's the difference between an indefinite article and a definite article. The only difference between a and an, which are both indefinite articles, is that an is used in front of a word that begins with a vowel sound, an open sound like apple or orange. The article a is used before a noun that begins with a consonant sound, a closed sound like potato or tomato. So you'd refer to a potato, a tomato, an orange, an apple. The third type of modifying word is an adverb. An adverb modifies a verb or an adjective or another adverb. When an adverb is used in a sentence, it generally tells us how. It gives more information about the action described by the verb or the quality described by the adjective or even another adverb. Adverbs often end in ly, but not always. Here are some examples of typical adverbs, and we'll consider some examples of how these might be used in sentences. Adverbs include words like quickly, soon, very, rather, to, and not. That last example of an adverb, not, is one of the most commonly used. It often is used to interrupt a verb phrase. In other words, the word not is used in between words of a verb phrase, and when it's used in this way, it is negating the meaning of the verb phrase. It turns the verb from something that is happening into something that is not happening. And in fact, in the sample, in the way I just used the word not, that illustrates how the word not, the adverb not, is used to interrupt a verb phrase. We could refer to something that is happening, and is happening is the verb phrase, or something that is not happening. And by inserting the adverb not in the middle of the verb phrase, we turn the phrase into a negative rather than a positive. Adverbs are most often used to modify verbs. They tell how the action occurred. So, for example, you might say, he walks quickly. Here we have the adverb quickly, and it modifies or gives more information about the verb walks. Walks describes an action in this sentence, and quickly tells us a little bit more about what that action is like. It's a quick walk. It's walking that is being done quickly. It tells us how the walking is being done. So quickly, the adverb modifies the verb walks in this sentence. Notice how adverbs can also be used to modify adjectives or even other adverbs. Compare the sentence we just said, he walks quickly, with the following other sentences to see how these combinations of words can work together. He walks quickly. Quickly is an adverb modifying the verb walks. Now let's say, he is quick. The word quick, what part of speech is that in this sentence? In this sentence, the word quick is an adjective. It describes he, the pronoun he, it modifies he, tells us something about him, he is quick, and it follows the linking verb be and links the pronoun he with the adjective quick. So he is quick gives us a pronoun, a verb, and an adjective. Now what about this sentence? He is very quick. This is the same sentence except that the word very has been inserted. What part of speech is the word very? Well, very is an adverb. It's one of the more common adverbs, and in this case, the adverb very modifies or refers to the adjective quick. How quick is he? He's very quick. It gives us more information about that adjective. It tells us exactly how quick he is. So in this case, we have an adverb, very, which modifies an adjective. That illustrates how an adverb can sometimes modify an adjective. Finally, look at this sentence. He walks too quickly for me. Let's look at this sentence. He walks too quickly. What about the word quickly? Let's analyze that to begin with. What part of speech is that? Well, we've seen that words that end in ly are very often adverbs, and quickly is an adverb. What word does it modify in this sentence? It modifies the verb walks. It tells how he walks. He walks quickly. So quickly in this sentence is an adverb modifying the verb walks. Now what about the word too? He walks too quickly. What part of speech is too? Well, too is another adverb, and in this case, too is modifying the adverb quickly. Remember we said that an adverb can modify a verb, it can modify an adjective, or it can modify another adverb. This is an example of an adverb modifying another adverb. Quickly is an adverb modifying the verb walks. It tells us how he walks, quickly. The adverb too modifies the adverb quickly. It tells us how quickly he walks, too quickly. So, as we've seen in these examples, an adverb can modify a verb, it can modify an adjective, or it can modify another adverb. Notice that the adverb not, which we mentioned as one of the most important and common adverbs, is often contracted to N''T. To contract a word means to shorten it by leaving out some of the letters. And when you make a contraction in English, you mark the letters that have been omitted with an apostrophe. So the adverb not is shortened into the contraction N''T. So for example, look at these two sentences. William is not going to the movies with us. Here the adverb not appears in the middle of the verb phrase is going. Remember that the adverb not isn't part of the verb phrase, even though it interrupts it. The verb phrase in this sentence is going. Not is an adverb, which in this case interrupts the verb phrase or appears in the middle of it and changes its meaning to a negative. He is not going to the movies with us. Now look at this sentence. Sharon isn't going either. What's the verb phrase in this sentence? In this sentence, the verb is going. And in between, we have the adverb not, which has been contracted to N''T, pronounced int. Sharon isn't going. So even though is does not appear in this sentence as a word by itself, nonetheless, if you're asked what the verb is in this sentence, the correct answer would be the verb phrase is going. And not, the contraction N''T, has been stuck in the middle to negate the meaning. This sentence could have read, Sharon is not going either, but most often, for ease of reading, we would contract not to N''T and turn it into Sharon isn't going either. The use of contractions is considered slightly less formal than using the full word. So depending on the kind of writing you're doing, you may or may not choose to use contractions. But in most writing, contractions are considered appropriate, and this is an example of how they're used. So remember that the adverb not would not be considered part of the verb phrase, even though most often it would interrupt it. In your study guide, we've provided an exercise that will give you a chance to test your understanding of these concepts related to adjectives, articles, and adverbs. In this exercise, your job was to identify each adjective, each article, and each adverb in the sentences. Let's go through them one by one. First, when water in a lake is deeply tinged with red, a heavy growth of algae is present. Let's start with adjectives. Well, there are a few adjectives here, and recognizing them may be tricky in at least one instance. Heavy is an adjective. It refers to or modifies the noun that follows, growth. And present is another adjective. Remember, we said that adjectives sometimes appear after a verb of being. The verb of being links the adjective to the noun that comes before the verb of being. So the adjective present refers back to the growth. The growth is what is present. So the noun growth and the adjective present are being linked together by the linking verb, or the verb of being is. There's another word here which could be considered an adjective, and different grammarians will give different opinions, and it doesn't make a great deal of difference whether you define this as an adjective or not. But the word tinged in this sentence might be considered an adjective as well. There are really two ways of looking at this. In this particular sentence, you could say that is tinged is a verb phrase referring to the water having been tinged or colored. And is tinged could be considered a verb phrase in which tinged would be the main verb and is would be a helping verb. Another way of looking at this would be to consider is as a verb of being which links water with an adjective, tinged, meaning colored. Some adjectives do end in ed and are derived from verbs. So tinged could be considered an adjective, or it could be considered part of the verb. And you should consider either one correct. Grammatically, it doesn't make much difference in how the sentence would be constructed, and it's, in a sense, simply a difference in name or wording. So those are the adjectives in the sentence. You might have been tempted by the word red, because the word red is often used as an adjective. You might refer to the red ball that came bouncing down the street, in which case red is an adjective describing the noun ball. In this case, however, red is being used as a noun. The sentence says that the water in the lake is deeply tinged with red. Red is being described here as a kind of a substance, a thing that has been used to tinge or color the water. So red is a thing in this sentence, and therefore it's a noun rather than an adjective. Remember that the same word can be used as more than one part of speech, depending on how it's used in the sentence. What about articles? Those are easy to recognize because there are just three words that can be articles, a, an, and the. And in this sentence we have the word a appearing twice. When water in a lake is deeply tinged with red, a heavy growth of algae is present. So a or a appears twice in this sentence, and those are the two articles. Finally, adverbs. Remember, we said that adverbs often end in ly, and we've got one of those in this sentence, deeply. The adverb deeply in this sentence modifies the adjective tinged. It tells us how the water is tinged with red. How is it tinged? Deeply. Remember, adverbs often answer the question how, or tell us how something happens or appears. So in this case, it is deeply tinged. That's how it is tinged. And deeply is an adverb modifying the adjective tinged. Let's look at the second sentence. If Peter has enough free time next summer, he will visit southern Italy on his vacation. We have three adjectives in this sentence. Free is an adjective modifying the noun time. It tells what kind of time, free time. Next is an adjective modifying the noun summer. It tells us what summer, which summer, next summer. It gives more information about the summer being referred to. Finally, southern is an adjective. It modifies the proper noun, Italy. It gives us more information about Italy, or it tells us more about Italy. What part of Italy? Southern Italy. There's no article in this sentence. The words a, an, and the don't appear, but there is one adverb, enough. The adverb enough in this case modifies the adjective free. Remember, we saw that free is an adjective modifying the noun time. Enough is an adverb giving us more information about free, or about the free time. How much free time, or what kind of free time? Enough free time. So enough is an adverb modifying the adjective free in this sentence. How about our third sentence? Auto racing is generally considered one of the most dangerous sports in the world. Let's look for adjectives first. The first word in the sentence is an adjective, auto. Remember, we pointed out that some words that are usually used as nouns can sometimes be used as adjectives when they are used in such a way as to modify other nouns. That's what's happening here. The word auto is most often used as a noun. You refer to an auto coming down the street. The auto is a thing that is being referred to, and therefore it's a noun. In this case, however, we have the noun racing, describing or naming an activity, and we have auto being used as an adjective to give more information about the racing. What kind of racing? Auto racing. So here we have a word that's usually a noun being used as an adjective. Auto is an adjective. Considered is another word which in this particular sentence could be considered either an adjective or a verb. It could be considered part of the verb phrase is considered, or it could be considered an adjective which is linked to the noun racing by the be verb is. So considered could be considered an adjective or a verb, depending on which term you happen to prefer. Either one could be correct. Dangerous is another adjective. In this sentence, it modifies or gives more information about the noun sports. And we have two articles in this sentence. Both of them are the, one of the most dangerous sports in the world. So both of those should have been marked on your sheet as articles. Finally, there are two adverbs. Generally is an adverb. Again, notice the ending ly, which is commonly found on adverbs, and it modifies the adjective considered. How or when is it considered a dangerous sport? Generally. So it gives more information about that adjective considered. And remember, a word that modifies an adjective is an adverb. And most is another adverb. We're told that auto racing is generally considered one of the most dangerous sports in the world. So it's a dangerous sport. Dangerous is an adjective. And how dangerous? Most dangerous. So most is an adverb which gives more information about the adjective dangerous. An adverb modifying an adjective. Let's look at our next sentence. Silver Blaze was recently selected as the best story about the adventures of the famous detective Sherlock Holmes. We've got a number of adjectives here. The first one is the first word in the sentence, silver. We can see from the way it's being used here that silver is an adjective giving information about the noun blaze. What kind of blaze? A silver blaze. Silver is a word describing a color, and color words very often are used as adjectives. Selected could be considered an adjective. Once again, it's on the borderline between an adjective or a verb. Best is an adjective. It modifies or gives more information about the noun story. And famous is an adjective. It modifies or gives more information about the noun detective. So silver, selected, best, and famous could all be considered adjectives. We have three articles in this sentence. All of them happen to be the word the. The best story about the adventures of the famous detective Sherlock Holmes. And there's one adverb, recently. Again, it has the telltale ly ending, and it tells more about or modifies the adjective selected. When was it selected? Recently. So it gives more information about the adjective, it modifies the adjective, and that makes it an adverb. And our final sentence. The veterinarian arrived too late to save the injured bird. We have one adjective in this sentence, injured. It gives more information about the noun bird. It tells us something more about the bird. We have two articles, both of them the word the. And finally, we have two adverbs here. One adverb is the adverb late. What word does that adverb late modify? It modifies the verb arrived. It tells when the veterinarian arrived. The veterinarian arrived late. So the word late is an adverb modifying the verb arrived. Now what about the word to? You might remember to from our list of common adverbs. What does to modify in this sentence? Well, in this sentence, to modifies the adverb late. How late did the veterinarian arrive? Too late. So it gives more information about the adverb late. And remember, an adverb can modify a verb, it can modify an adjective, or it can modify an adverb. So in this case, we have one adverb late modifying the verb arrived, and then we have another adverb to modifying the adverb late. Two adverbs in a row, too late. Did you get most of these words correct? I hope so. When you're ready, let's move on to the next lesson. Okay, let's pause to review. We've talked about 6 different kinds of parts of speech so far: verbs, nouns, pronouns, adjectives, articles, and adverbs. We have 9 parts of speech to talk about altogether, so there are 3 more to do. In this lesson, we'll talk about 2 kinds of connecting words: prepositions and conjunctions. First, a preposition relates a noun or pronoun to another part of the sentence. There are many different kinds of prepositions. Many of them are short words which describe a relationship between the noun or pronoun that follows and the rest of the sentence. Here are some examples of prepositions: in, for, by, from, with, to, below, through, and there are many more. One thing that's special about prepositions is that they're always followed by either a noun or a pronoun, most often a noun. The whole combination of words, the preposition and the noun that follows, is called a prepositional phrase. So whenever you see a preposition, always look for the entire prepositional phrase that the preposition introduces. So you would always see a preposition followed by a noun or a pronoun. And altogether, that combination of words makes a prepositional phrase, which fits into the sentence and adds further information about the meaning of the sentence. So looking at the prepositions I just listed for you, you can imagine for yourself a number of prepositional phrases that these prepositions could be part of. In my house, for my sister, by William Shakespeare, from New York, with my father-in-law, to Chicago, below the equator, through the tunnel, and so on. Now, some prepositions consist of more than one word. Here are a few examples: according to, because of, in front of, instead of, prior to. And again, there are other examples. You can see that although these prepositions consist of more than one word, the 2 or 3 words that make up the preposition work together and have a single meaning. And once again, each of these prepositions would come before a noun or a pronoun and form a prepositional phrase. According to the weatherman, because of today's rain, in front of the hotel, instead of dinner, prior to bedtime, and so on. So these are prepositions. They're connecting words because they connect the noun or pronoun that follows to the rest of the sentence. The other type of connecting word that's important is a conjunction. A conjunction connects 2 or more other words. There are a few different kinds of conjunctions that you need to be aware of. First, coordinating conjunctions. A coordinating conjunction connects words, phrases, or clauses. And there are 7 different coordinating conjunctions. They are and, but, or, nor, for, yet, and so. Each of these 7 coordinating conjunctions can be used to join a pair of words, or a pair of phrases, such as prepositional phrases, or a pair of clauses. For example, when we talked about sentence structure in the program by that name, we saw how coordinating conjunctions can be used to join 2 independent clauses to create what's known as a compound sentence. That's a common use for coordinating conjunctions. Notice that these 7 coordinating conjunctions join two elements which are more or less equal in value, so that when you connect words, phrases, or clauses with a word like and, or but, or nor, generally speaking, the two things that are being connected are roughly equal in importance. That's one characteristic of how coordinating conjunctions are used. A second type of conjunction to be aware of is the subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction connects clauses, making the clause that follows the conjunction a subordinate clause. Again, in our lesson about sentence structure, we talk a fair amount about subordinating conjunctions. So if you haven't watched that program, you probably should, to get a little more background on how subordinating conjunctions are used. Subordinating conjunctions make the clause that follows into a subordinate clause, meaning one that can't stand alone as a sentence. For example, take a subordinating conjunction such as if. If the subordinating conjunction if is put in front of a clause, a group of words including a subject and a verb, that clause can no longer stand alone as a sentence. It becomes a subordinate clause, one that needs to be connected to another clause to make a complete sentence. So, for example, we might have a clause like the following: it rains this afternoon. That could stand alone as a sentence. However, when we put the subordinating conjunction if in front of it, it can no longer stand alone as a sentence. If it rains this afternoon, suddenly it feels incomplete. Something more needs to be added to turn it into a complete thought. If it rains this afternoon, the picnic will be canceled. A subordinating conjunction then creates a subordinate clause, which means a clause that can't stand alone as a sentence. Notice the difference between a subordinating conjunction and a coordinating conjunction. We said that coordinating conjunctions join two things that are more or less equal in importance. A subordinating conjunction joins one thing which is independent, an independent clause, and a clause which is subordinate, less important, can't stand alone as a sentence. So, whereas a coordinating conjunction links two things that are equal in value, the subordinating conjunction links two things that are unequal or different in value and importance. Here's the third and final kind of conjunction to be aware of: the correlative conjunction. A correlative conjunction comes in pairs, and there are four most important correlative conjunctions to be aware of: both and, either or, neither nor, not only but also. And the most important thing to be aware of about correlative conjunctions is that they always should be used correctly in pairs. So whenever you begin with both, you need to follow up with and. So both my mother and my father will be coming to the awards banquet. When you begin with either, you need to follow through with or. Neither needs to be completed with nor. And not only needs to be completed with but also. A common mistake that people make is to use one but not the other. The correlative conjunction must be used in its entirety, so whenever you use the first part of it, you need to use the second part. So these three types of conjunctions are important to recognize: coordinating conjunctions, subordinating conjunctions, and correlative conjunctions. They fit into different kinds of sentences and need to be followed, used according to certain specific rules. For this exercise, your job was simply to identify the conjunctions and the prepositions that appear in these sentences. Let's start with sentence 1. If gasoline prices keep rising, driving to work will become more and more expensive. Well, there are two conjunctions in this sentence. The sentence begins with a subordinating conjunction, if. That's one of the most common subordinating conjunctions. It introduces a clause which is a subordinate clause, a clause that can't stand alone as a sentence. If gasoline prices keep rising, that can't stand alone as a sentence. It's a subordinate clause, and the word that introduces it is a subordinating conjunction, if. The other conjunction is and, Remember that there are 7 coordinating conjunctions which connect words or phrases or clauses that are more or less equal in importance. Here, and is connecting the word more and more expensive. And is the most common of the 7 coordinating conjunctions. So that's the second conjunction that appears in this sentence. There's one preposition, to, driving to work. Remember that a preposition always introduces a prepositional phrase, and what follows the preposition is a noun or a pronoun. In this case, work is a noun. Work is one of those words that can be used as more than one part of speech. Work is often used as a verb. When you say, I work in the garden, you are using it as a verb because it describes action. In this case, driving to work uses work as a noun. Here, in this case, it almost describes a place. That's where you are driving to, work. So work is a noun in this case. It's the object of the preposition to. The whole thing is the prepositional phrase, to work. So to is the preposition here. Let's look at the next sentence. In my opinion, Picasso was the greatest painter of the 20th century and one of the greatest of any era. There's just one conjunction in this sentence. It's the common coordinating conjunction, and. It appears near the end of the sentence. However, there are 4 prepositions, and in fact, prepositions often appear in large numbers in sentences. Many sentences have several prepositional phrases, and this sentence illustrates that. In my opinion is the first prepositional phrase. In is the preposition. Of the 20th century is a prepositional phrase, beginning with the preposition of and ending with the noun a century. Of the greatest is another prepositional phrase, and of any era is a prepositional phrase. So the 4 prepositions here are in, of, and of. Notice that this sentence includes 4 prepositional phrases, 3 of which begin with the preposition of, and yet the sentence doesn't sound terribly repetitive or awkward, does it? In my opinion, Picasso was the greatest painter of the 20th century and one of the greatest of any era. It sounds fine. And that illustrates the fact that in English, it's easy to use several prepositional phrases in a sentence and create a sentence whose meaning is clear and which sounds perfectly correct and easy to read. So there's one of the lessons of this particular program, that prepositional phrases are very versatile and are good to use to express complicated meanings in English. Here's our third sentence. Neither the coach nor the players could explain the dismal performance turned in by the soccer team against their local rivals. This sentence you might have found a little more tricky. There is a conjunction in this sentence that might have been a little difficult for you to recognize. This is a correlative conjunction. Remember, those are conjunctions that work in pairs, and the correlative conjunction appears near the beginning of the sentence. Neither nor. Remember, we said that when you use neither, you have to always follow up with nor. Those 2 words always belong together, so when you begin with neither, you need to use nor within a few words. So in this sentence, the correlative conjunction neither nor has been used correctly. Neither the coach nor the players. The correlative conjunction in this case is being used to connect 2 nouns, coach and players. We don't have any other conjunctions in the sentence, but we do have 2 prepositions, introducing, of course, prepositional phrases. By is the first preposition, introducing the prepositional phrase by the soccer team, and against their local rivals. Against is the preposition, and against their local rivals is the prepositional phrase. You might have been confused by the use of the word in. The word in can sometimes be a preposition. You could say, in my house, and there you have a prepositional phrase beginning with the preposition in and ending with the noun house. However, in this sentence, the word in is actually part of an idiomatic phrase. I use that expression, although I haven't used the word idiomatic previously in this program. In this case, the sentence refers to the dismal performance turned in by the soccer team against their local rivals. I think you can hear that the word in is really linked here to the verb turned. And together, the word turned in, or that phrase, creates a kind of a verbal idiom, which means the performance registered by the soccer team, or the performance that the soccer team gave that day. So turned in, rather than in being a preposition introducing a prepositional phrase, turned in instead is kind of a verbal phrase, idiomatic, meaning that's just an expression that's used in English. And the word in this case, is not being used as a preposition, but rather is connected to the verb turned, and the whole thing becomes a verbal idiom with a particular meaning, the two words being connected almost as one thing. So the word in there might have been tempting to be marked as a preposition, but the way it's used in this sentence, it really doesn't operate that way. Remember, a preposition would always be followed by a noun, which isn't the case here. Our next sentence. According to most surveys, parents usually prefer sending their children to schools located in the neighborhoods where they live. Well, there are two clauses here, and the second clause is introduced by a subordinating conjunction. Remember that a clause is any group of words that includes a subject and a verb. And this sentence ends with the clause, where they live. That's a subordinate clause. It contains the verb live, the subject they, and it begins with the subordinating conjunction where. Because of that subordinating conjunction, this clause can't stand alone as a sentence. You couldn't say where they live and leave that alone as a sentence. The word that begins it, where, is the subordinating conjunction, which turns it into a subordinate clause. There are also three prepositions in this sentence, and the first one is made up of more than one word, according to. That introduces the prepositional phrase, according to most surveys. The noun surveys concludes the prepositional phrase, and according to, those two words work together as one preposition. To is another preposition, to schools, and in the neighborhoods, is the third and final preposition in this sentence. Now our last example. We missed the last bus of the night, so we traveled to Oakland by taxi instead. In this sentence, we have two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. The first clause is, we missed the last bus of the night. The second clause is, we traveled to Oakland by taxi instead. Both are independent clauses because each could stand alone as a sentence. The two clauses are linked by a coordinating conjunction. So, remember there are just 7 coordinating conjunctions, and, but, or, nor, for, yet, and so. And your choice of which one to use will depend on the meaning of the sentence. Here, the word so makes sense. And remember that coordinating conjunctions link two things that are more or less equal in importance or meaning, and that's the case here. In addition, the sentence contains 3 prepositions, of, in the prepositional phrase of the night, to, in to Oakland, and by, in by taxi. So there's 1 coordinating conjunction and 3 prepositions in this sentence. We've gone through 8 of the 9 parts of speech, so that means there's only 1 left. And this last one is the simplest and, in a way, the funniest. An interjection expresses a strong emotion and is not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. In other words, an interjection is a word that just kind of hangs out there by itself. Doesn't happen in writing very often, happens a little more often in speech, but it isn't much of a grammatical problem. Here are some examples of interjections. Gosh, yikes, ouch, hooray, or Homer Simpson's favorite, doh. Those are interjections. And since they're not connected grammatically to the rest of the sentence, you don't need to know much about them. Recognizing parts of speech is, for some students, a little tricky. Why is it important to be able to recognize parts of speech in a sentence? It's because in order to apply the rules of proper grammar, you need to know what kind of words you're dealing with, because there are particular rules that apply to the use of verbs, nouns, pronouns, adjectives, and so on. We've already talked a bit about some of those rules, and in all the other programs that are part of this series, more of those rules and their applications will be explained. So being able to recognize parts of speech in the sentences that you write is rather important. Here are a couple of tips about how to recognize parts of speech in sentences that you're writing. First, the easiest thing to find is usually the main verb. So look for the verb that appears in the sentence when you're trying to identify parts of speech in your sentences. Then look for the subject of the verb, that is, the person, place, thing, or idea which does the action of the verb, or which the state of being of the verb refers to. That subject will be a noun or a pronoun. Once you've identified the verb and the noun or pronoun which is the subject of the verb, you can then begin to fill in the rest of the sentence. You can identify the modifying words, adjectives, articles, and adverbs. You can identify the connecting words, the conjunctions and prepositions. And little by little you can fill out all the rest of the sentence and understand how it all works together. So begin by identifying the verb, then look for the subject of the verb, and gradually fill in the other parts of the sentence. That's usually the easiest way to understand the structure of a sentence. And remember, too, that the same word may be used as more than one part of speech. We've already seen a couple of examples, but let me leave you with one more illustration of this important fact. So you can't tell, remember, a word's part of speech just by looking at it in isolation. You need to look at how it's being used in the sentence. Take a word like surprise. A word like surprise can be used as more than one part of speech. In this sentence, Ben surprised Nancy with a party on her birthday. The word surprised is being used as a verb. It describes the action that Ben took, what he did in the sentence. How about in this sentence? It was a surprise party. Here, surprise is being used as an adjective. It modifies or gives more information about the noun party. It tells what kind of party, a surprise party. How about in this sentence? That was quite a surprise. Here, surprise is being used as a noun. It's a thing. The party is being described as a certain type of thing, namely a surprise. So, in these three sentences, the word surprise is being used first as a verb, then as an adjective, then as a noun. This is a very common phenomenon in the English language, the same word being adapted to serve several different purposes. So always look carefully at the word in the context of the sentence before you decide what part of speech it is. In your study guide, we have an exercise designed to test and to let you practice your ability to recognize parts of speech. Let's look at the first sentence and then decide what part of speech each of these words represents. My car gets 30 miles to the gallon. Following my recommendation a moment ago, let's start by looking for the verb. The verb here is gets. What is the subject of the verb? The subject is the noun car, and it's preceded by the pronoun my. My is, in this case, referring back to myself. I am the antecedent, even though I don't appear in the sentence. And pronoun my is what's technically known as a possessive pronoun. Notice that it's used almost in the same way as an adjective. But it's a pronoun because it's referring back to a person, and therefore it's taking the place of a noun. So my car gets is pronoun, noun, verb. The remaining words are an adjective, a noun, a preposition, an article, and a noun. So 30 is an adjective. It modifies the noun miles. 2 is a preposition, and it's followed by the article, the, and the noun gallon. Now let's look at the second sentence. People say that too many young athletes today are selfish. There are two verbs in this sentence. Say is the first verb, and its subject is the noun people. The second verb is are, which is a verb of being near the end of the sentence, and its subject is the noun athletes. Now we can fill in the other words, now that we've identified the verbs and their subjects. The word that is a pronoun. Technically, it's known as a relative pronoun, and what it's doing is introducing a subordinate clause. So that is a pronoun. To is an adverb modifying the adjective many. Young is another adjective modifying athletes. And today is an adverb which modifies the verb are. That is, the young athletes of today are selfish. When are they selfish, or how are they selfish? They are selfish today. So the adverb today modifies that verb are. And the final word, selfish, is another adjective. Remember, we saw that adjectives can sometimes follow a verb of being and refer back to the noun, which is the subject of the verb. In this case, the adjective selfish follows the verb are and refers back to the athletes. So the athletes, noun, are selfish, adjective. Let's look at the next sentence. The Hudson River in New York is not actually a river. In fact, it is a tidal estuary. Two verbs in this sentence. The first one is, and the subject is river. The entire first clause is talking about what the Hudson River is. So river is the noun, which is the subject of the verb is. The second verb is also is in the second clause, and the pronoun it is its subject. Now let's talk about the other words here. We said that river is a noun. The Hudson, preceding the word river, are an article and an adjective. Hudson is an adjective telling what river. In is a preposition, and New York is a noun. It's a proper noun naming a particular state in the United States, and it's the object of the preposition. It's part of the entire prepositional phrase, in New York. We saw that not is one of the most common adverbs, and that's how it's being used here. And actually is another adverb, also modifying the verb is. A is, of course, an article, and river is a noun. Now we move into the second clause. In fact is a prepositional phrase. So in is the preposition, and fact is a noun. It is a pronoun. Is, we've already seen, is the verb. And a tidal estuary is an article, an adjective, and a noun. Estuary is a noun because it names a particular thing. It's a difficult word, so perhaps you don't know that word, but you can tell from the way it's used in this sentence that it must be a noun. For example, it's introduced by an article. So even if you never saw the word estuary before, you can tell it's a noun because the sentence refers to a tidal estuary. And you only put an article in front of a noun. And tidal is an adjective because it tells what kind of estuary. So that's how we would identify the various words in this sentence. How about the next example? Paul Klee created some of the greatest abstract paintings of the 20th century. The verb here is created, and the subject is the noun Paul Klee, a proper noun naming a particular person. Now let's look at the rest of the sentence. Some is a pronoun. Remember, we talked a bit about indefinite pronouns, pronouns which refer to some unnamed thing or group of things. And the some here is referring to an unknown or unidentified group. So it is a pronoun, an indefinite pronoun. Of the greatest abstract paintings, all of that is a prepositional phrase. Of is the preposition that begins it. The is an article. Greatest and abstract are both adjectives, and paintings is the noun. So the whole thing taken together is a prepositional phrase, beginning with a preposition and ending with a noun. And the last words of the sentence are also a prepositional phrase, of the 20th century. Of is the preposition, century is the noun, and in between we have the article, the, and the adjective 20th. Now our last example. Wow, you have a really beautiful view of the Rocky Mountains from your balcony. Of course, we had to stick in at least one example of an interjection, and the first word here, wow, is our interjection. It has an exclamation point, which interjections often do, and it's not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. The meaning is connected, but there's no special linkage grammatically. Now let's look at the rest of the sentence. The verb is have, and the subject of the verb is you, which is a pronoun. So you have, pronoun and verb, that's the heart of the sentence. Let's look at the rest of what's here. A really beautiful view. A is an article, of course. Really is an adverb. and beautiful is an adjective. All of this goes to modify the noun view. Beautiful is an adjective modifying view, and the adverb really modifies the adjective beautiful. How beautiful? Really beautiful. So any word that modifies an adjective would be an adverb, and that's what really is. Of the Rocky Mountains is a prepositional phrase. Of is the preposition. The is an article. Rocky is an adjective, and mountains is the noun, which Rocky modifies. So of the Rocky Mountains begins with a preposition, ends with a noun, prepositional phrase. And the sentence ends with one more prepositional phrase, from your balcony. From is the preposition, balcony is the noun, and in between we have the pronoun your. Again, it's a possessive pronoun. It tells whose balcony, yours. So the antecedent of that pronoun would be you, the hearer of this sentence. And in effect, the pronoun here acts as a kind of an adjective because it gives a little more information about the noun balcony. You now have a pretty good idea of how these 9 different parts of speech are fitted together to create English sentences. In a way, it's amazing, isn't it, that just 9 different kinds of words can be put together in different combinations to express almost any conceivable human emotion or idea. In the other programs in this series, we'll provide you with additional pointers and rules to follow in selecting among these 9 parts of speech and fitting them together to create English sentences that express your meaning accurately and that are also grammatically correct. I hope you've found this program enjoyable and helpful, and thanks for watching. This program. Do you like compliments? Most people do. Gee, I like what you've done with this apartment. Your hair looks good today. Great shoes. Well, the kinds of compliments we'll be talking about in this program are a little different. The kind of compliments I just talked about are spelled C-O-M-P-L-I-M-E-N-T-S. The compliments we'll be talking about in this program use the letter E in place of the letter I. And that word compliment is connected with the verb complete. To complete something is to finish it or to round it out. And a sentence complement is a word or a group of words that completes the thought begun by the subject and the verb in a sentence. We've been talking in other programs in this series about how a sentence is a bit like a machine made up of various parts. The sentence complement is one of the important kinds of parts that go to make up a sentence, and it's important that you understand how to use sentence complements in order to express your meaning clearly and accurately. In this program, we'll talk about the different kinds of sentence complements and give you some basic rules for using them correctly in English sentences. Before we can talk directly about sentence complements, we need to talk about 3 kinds of verbs in English. As you'll see, each of these 3 kinds of verbs is related to a particular type of sentence complement. The 3 main kinds of verbs in English are transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. Let's take a look at each. A transitive verb expresses action that passes from the subject of the verb to an object of the verb. As you recall, a verb is a word that expresses action or state of being. A transitive verb is always an action verb. The subject of the verb is the person or thing that does the action of the verb. The object of a transitive verb receives the action. Take a look at this sentence as an example. Omar typed the letter. Now, what's the verb in this sentence? The verb is the word typed. What's the subject of the verb typed? That is, who or what did the typing? The answer is Omar. So Omar is the subject, typed is the verb. Now, this is a transitive verb because it has an object, that is, something that receives the action of the verb. Who or what receives the action of the typing in this sentence? The answer is letter. The word letter is a noun which is receiving the action of the verb typed, and therefore it's the object of the verb. Because the verb typed has an object which receives the action, we refer to typed as a transitive verb. Here's another example. Lorraine swam 20 laps. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is swam. What's the subject of the verb swam? That is, who or what did the swimming? The answer, Lorraine. Lorraine swam. Now, what did Lorraine swim? That is, what receives the action of the verb swam in this sentence? The answer is laps. Laps is a noun which receives the action of the verb swam. It tells us what Lorraine swam. So laps is the object of the verb swam, and therefore, in this sentence, swam is a transitive verb, because only a transitive verb expresses action that passes from the subject of the verb to an object. Now, the second type of verb is an intransitive verb. As you may know, the prefix in English usually means not. It takes the meaning of the word and reverses it or negates it. So you might be able to guess that an intransitive verb is a verb that is not transitive, and that's exactly right. Here's the definition. An intransitive verb expresses action that does not have an object. We saw a moment ago that a transitive verb has an object which receives the action of the verb. An intransitive verb doesn't have such an object. Take a look at this sentence. Elliot slept. This is a short sentence, only 2 words, but it is a complete sentence. It has a subject and a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. In this sentence, the verb is slept, and the subject is Elliot. And the verb does not have any object. It expresses a complete thought without having an object. We don't need to ask, what did Elliot sleep? Because the meaning is complete without any object. Elliot slept, that tells us exactly what happened. It's perfectly clear, and it doesn't sound incomplete. So slept in this sentence is an intransitive verb. It has no object, and it doesn't need one. Here's another example. Jacques laughed. Again, it's a very short sentence, but it is complete. It contains a subject and a verb. The verb is laughed. The subject is Jacques. Jacques is the one doing the laughing. And there is no object. The sentence doesn't tell us what Jacques laughed. He simply laughed. That's a complete thought, a complete idea in itself, and no object is needed. Once again, we're dealing with an intransitive verb in this sentence. The third type of verb is a linking verb. A linking verb expresses a state of being. It links the subject to another word in the sentence. Remember that our definition of verb explains that a verb is a word that expresses an action or a state of being. Both transitive and intransitive verbs express actions. A linking verb expresses a state of being. Rather than telling us what the subject does, it tells us what the subject is. The most common linking verb is be, and the word be in many different forms is found in lots of sentences. Some other common linking verbs are act, appear, seem, taste, and turn. And there are quite a few others. You can recognize a linking verb by the fact that what follows the linking verb and the subject of the linking verb are in some way the same. The linking verb is called a linking verb because it links those two things and in some way equates them or tells us that they are one and the same thing. Here are a couple of examples. Karim is a school teacher. We said a moment ago that the verb to be is the most common linking verb. Here's an example of a form of the verb to be. The verb is. What's the subject of the verb is? Karim. Karim is the one who is. And following the verb is, we're told exactly what Karim is. A teacher, or specifically a school teacher. So in this case, the subject Karim is being linked by the linking verb is to the word teacher. Karim is teacher. And the words a school are giving a little more information about what kind of teacher. Notice that is operating here as a linking verb because it's linking Karim and teacher. It's telling us that Karim and teacher are in some way the same thing. And in fact, they are. That's what Karim is. So the two things are being linked or equated to one another. And that's how a linking verb works. As I've said, the verb to be is the most common linking verb, but there are a number of others. Here's an example. Leanna looked nervous. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is looked. The subject is Leanna. That tells us who looked. And the word that follows looked is the word nervous. And this is being linked to Leanna by the linking verb looked. We can tell that in this sentence looked is operating as a linking verb because Leanna and the word that follows, nervous, are being linked or equated with one another. We're being told that Leanna and nervous are in some way the same thing. And in fact, we know that Leanna is nervous. Notice that in this case, the verb looked, which is a linking verb in this sentence, is being used to mean almost the same as the verb to be. When we say that Leanna looked nervous, we're saying in a way that Leanna is or was nervous. So the verb looked is being used as a linking verb in a way that's similar to the way the verb to be is used. We're being told that Leanna and nervous are linked or equated in some way. And that's why looked is being used in this sentence as a linking verb. One more example. Edgardo felt optimistic. In this sentence, the verb is felt, and the subject is Edgardo. And what did Edgardo feel? He felt optimistic. Once again, felt is being used as a linking verb in this sentence because Edgardo and optimistic are being linked. They are being equated. When we say that Edgardo felt optimistic, that's almost the same thing as saying he was optimistic. It's just putting a slightly different meaning on it. So in this sentence, felt is being used as a linking verb, and what comes before and after the linking verb, those two things are being equated or being made to appear the same. Edgardo and optimistic go together, and that's why felt is considered a linking verb in this sentence. These then are the three kinds of verbs: transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. And as you'll see in a moment, it's important to understand the difference in order to understand how sentence complements are used. Notice that some verbs can be used as more than one kind of verb. In other words, the very same verb word can be used in a transitive way or an intransitive way, or perhaps as a linking verb. Take a look at these examples. Miguel ran. Here's a short sentence which expresses a complete thought in itself. The verb is ran, the subject is Miguel. And when we read this sentence, we understand Miguel ran. Perhaps he's a runner on the track team and went out running this morning. And we could say, well, Miguel ran. This could be a complete sentence. And in this case, the verb ran is being used as what kind of verb? Transitive, intransitive, or linking? In this case, ran is being used as an intransitive verb. Remember that an intransitive verb doesn't have any object. The action simply stops with the verb ran, and the action does not pass on to an object that follows the verb. Miguel ran, a complete sentence in itself, and ran is an intransitive verb. But now compare it to this sentence. Jorge ran the car wash. Here we have the same verb, ran, but it's used in a very different way than in the previous sentence. In the previous sentence, we saw that the verb ran had no object. Miguel ran, and that was the end of the sentence. In this case, the verb ran does have an object. The action of the verb ran is being passed on to something which is receiving that action, namely the car wash. That is what Jorge ran. So in this sentence, the verb ran, this very same verb that we saw a moment ago being used as an intransitive verb, is being used as a transitive verb, a verb that has an object which receives the action of the verb. So these two sentences show us that the same verb can sometimes be used as either a transitive verb or an intransitive verb. Here's another example of how the role played by the same verb may change from one sentence to the next. Anna grew tomatoes. In this sentence, the verb is grew. The subject is Anna. Now, what did Anna grow? Is there an object to the verb grew? Yes, there is. She grew tomatoes. So the noun tomatoes is the object of the verb grew. It receives the action of the verb. Therefore, what kind of verb is grew in this sentence? It's a transitive verb because remember, only transitive verbs pass the action along to an object. Compare that with this sentence. Tova grew hungry. Here we have the same verb, grew, but the meaning is a little different and the structure of the sentence is different. In this case, the verb grew doesn't have an object. This word hungry doesn't tell us a thing that Tova grew the way Anna grew tomatoes. Hungry isn't a noun, and it doesn't name some object which receives the action of the verb grew. Instead, it tells us what Tova was. Therefore, what kind of verb is grew? In this case, grew is being used as a linking verb. The two words Tova and hungry are being linked or equated. We're being told, in effect, that Tova was hungry. She grew hungry, that is, she got to be hungry over time, but in effect, the two things are being equated with one another. Tova was hungry. That's another way of saying almost the same thing as Tova grew hungry. So in this particular example, the verb grew is being used as a linking verb. It is linking Tova and hungry. The two things are being equated with one another. Hungry is not the object of the action. It's not receiving the action in the way the tomatoes received the action of growing in the sentence about Anna. Instead, grew is being used as a linking verb, and Tova and hungry are being equated with one another. Once again, notice that the very same verb can be used with different meanings to play a different role in a sentence. So the same verb may be a transitive verb or an intransitive verb or a linking verb. You can't tell what type of verb a verb is just by looking at the verb in isolation. Instead, you have to look at it in the context of the sentence and understand how it's being used and how it relates to the words nearby. In your study guide, we've provided an exercise which will enable you to test your understanding of these concepts. In this exercise, your job is to look at the underlined verb in each sentence and decide whether it's being used as a transitive verb, an intransitive verb, or a linking verb. Let's start with the first sentence. The author Earl Stanley Gardner wrote a number of books using the pen name A.A. Fair. Now in this sentence, the verb wrote is underlined. In order to determine whether it's a transitive verb, an intransitive verb, or a linking verb, you need to decide whether it's a verb of action or a verb of being. And if it's a verb of action, whether there is something in the sentence which receives the action of the verb. Well, in this case, wrote is being used as a verb of action. It is telling us something that the author Earl Stanley Gardner did. And is there anything in the sentence which receives the action of the verb wrote? That is, does the sentence tell us something that Earl Stanley Gardner wrote? The answer is yes. There is something that receives the action of the verb in this sentence. It's the word number. Or to give the entire phrase, it's a number of books. That's what he wrote. He wrote a number of books. And therefore, there is an object that's receiving the action of the verb. The verb wrote, its action flows through to a number of books. Therefore, wrote is being used as a transitive verb. Because remember, only a transitive verb has an object which follows it, which receives the action of the verb. Let's look at the next example. Upon closer examination, several spokes of the bicycle's rear wheel appeared broken. In this sentence, the verb appeared is underlined. Let's begin by asking, what's the subject of the verb appeared? The answer is the word spokes. Don't be misled by the fact that several words come between the word spokes and the word appeared. It's the spokes that appeared broken. What kind of spokes? The spokes of the bicycle's rear wheel. So that prepositional phrase, of the bicycle's rear wheel, simply modifies or gives more information about the spokes. That's not where the actual subject of the verb appears. The subject is spokes. So the spokes appeared broken. Now, in this case, is appeared being used as a verb of action or a verb of being? Well, it's being used as a verb of being because it's not telling us something that the spokes did, it's telling us something that the spokes were. Namely, they were broken. The word appeared is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be, and the two things are being linked. The spokes, which is the subject of the verb appeared, and the word broken, which comes after the verb, those two things are being linked, and we're being told that the spokes were broken. What comes before and after the verb are being equated in this sentence, so appeared is being used as a linking verb. Our next example. Ivan and Sasha danced together until 2 o'clock, when the band finally stopped playing. Now in this sentence, the word danced is underlined, so that's the verb that we want to focus on. What's the subject of the verb danced? The answer is Ivan and Sasha. Remember that the subject of a verb may be compound. That is, it may be two nouns that are joined by a word like and. So Ivan and Sasha are the subject of the verb danced. Now, does the verb danced here have an object which receives the action of the dancing? That is, are we being told something that Ivan and Sasha danced? Not in this sentence. We're being told that they danced together. That tells us how they danced. And we're being told that they danced together until 2 o'clock, which is a little more information about how they danced. The word together is an adverb because it gives more information about or modifies the verb danced. It tells us how they danced. And until 2 o'clock is a prepositional phrase that also gives us more information about how they danced. Neither one, however, is an object, and neither one is being linked to Ivan and Sasha. Neither one tells us what Ivan and Sasha were. Therefore, the verb danced, in this case, doesn't have an object, and it's not being used as a linking verb. It is an intransitive verb. Remember that an intransitive verb is a verb of action that doesn't have an object receiving the action, and that's the case in this sentence. The verb danced is being used here as an intransitive verb. Notice, by the way, that the verb danced can be used as a transitive verb. You could imagine a sentence in which there is an object receiving the action of the verb danced. For example, you could say, Ivan and Sasha danced the polka. In that sentence, the word polka would be receiving the action of the verb danced. It would be telling us what they danced. And we would have transformed the verb danced from an intransitive verb to a transitive verb, because there would be an object receiving the action of the verb. There is no such object in this sentence, and therefore the correct answer for this sentence in your exercise is intransitive. The next sentence. Even by modern engineering standards, the pyramids of Egypt remain an incredible achievement. The verb remain is underlined. What's the subject of the verb remain? What remain an incredible achievement? The answer is pyramids. Once again, the fact that some other words come between the subject and the verb shouldn't confuse you. It's not Egypt that remains an incredible achievement. It's the pyramids that remain an incredible achievement. Now, what about the words that follow remain? How do those relate back to the verb? Are they the object of the verb? That is, do they receive the action of the verb? Or do they play some other role? Well, in this case, remain is not a verb of action, but rather a verb of being. And therefore, you can probably anticipate that it's being used as a linking verb, because that's how verbs of being are used. And sure enough, what follows the verb remain is an incredible achievement. These words explain what the pyramids of Egypt are. They are an incredible achievement. So what comes before and after the verb in this sentence, those two things are being equated. We're being told that they are the same as one another. And that makes the verb remain a linking verb. Our next example. Working with extreme care, the bomb squad removed the suspicious package. In this sentence, the verb removed has been underlined, and the subject of the verb is the bomb squad, or specifically the word squad. Now, what did the bomb squad remove? Is there an object for the action of this verb? Yes, there is. The object is the noun package, or to give the complete phrase, the suspicious package. So the package is receiving the action of the verb removed. It's telling us what they removed. And therefore, package is the object of the transitive verb in this sentence. So for this last example in the exercise, the verb is being used as a transitive verb. Did you get all 5 of these questions right? I hope so. Let's turn now to Lesson 2. Now remember, the topic of this program is sentence complements. Everything we've been looking at so far relates to words or groups of words that complete the meaning of the subject and the verb. In the next lesson and the ones to follow, we're going to be talking about different kinds of subject complements. First, direct objects. A direct object is a noun or a pronoun that receives the action of a transitive verb. It answers the question, what or whom, after the transitive verb. By now, you're probably fairly familiar with the idea that a transitive verb passes the action along to some object. Well, technically, this is known as a direct object, and the reason that that particular term is important will become clear in a few moments when we move on to Lesson 3. A direct object is always a noun or a pronoun, and it receives the action of the transitive verb. So anytime a verb is being used as a transitive verb in a sentence, you can be sure that it's followed somewhere by a noun or a pronoun which receives the action of the verb, and which is known as the direct object. Of course, there may be other words nearby that modify or give more information about the direct object. But the one-word noun or pronoun that receives the action, that's what's known as the direct object. Take a look at this example. Elaine washed her car. What's the verb here? Washed. The subject, Elaine. And what did Elaine wash? She washed her car. Where's the noun or pronoun that tells us exactly what Elaine washed? The noun car tells us what Elaine washed. And so that's the direct object of the verb washed. The word her, which is a possessive pronoun, gives us a little more information about the car. It modifies the noun car by telling us which car, whose car it was. But the word car, that noun, is the direct object. It receives the action of the transitive verb washed. One more example. Derek applauded the band. What's the verb here? Applauded. The subject of the verb? Derek. And who or what did Derek applaud? Well, Derek applauded the band. So band, that noun, is the direct object of the transitive verb applauded. The article, is thrown in to give a little more information, to modify the band, to tell us which band. But the word band, that noun, is the direct object of the verb applauded. One more thing to realize about direct objects, they may be compound. We've already seen in this series that both subjects and verbs may be compound. That is, more than one word may be part of the subject and the verb, and the two or more subjects or verbs would then be joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as and. The same can be done with direct objects. That is, one sentence, one verb, may have more than one direct object, and the two or more direct objects would be joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as and. Here's an example. Dawn bought a blouse and a pair of shoes. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is bought. The subject, Dawn. She's the one who did the buying. Now, is there anything in the sentence that tells us what Dawn bought? Anything that receives the action of the buying? Well, the answer is there are really two things that Dawn bought. She bought a blouse and a pair of shoes. The two main nouns in those phrases would be the direct objects, blouse and pair. The other words that are there give us a little more information. What kind of blouse? A blouse. What kind of pair? A pair, and a pair specifically of shoes. So those other words give us more information about what kind of blouse and what kind of pair. Those two nouns, blouse and pair, are the two words that both go to make up the direct object in this sentence. So this is an example of how a sentence may contain a compound direct object with two or more things both of which receive the action of the transitive verb, in this case, bought. Turn to your study guide. We have an exercise now that will test your ability to recognize direct objects when they appear in sentences. Try your hand at the exercise, and then come back and we'll look at the questions together. In this exercise, your assignment was to decide whether a direct object appears in the sentence. Not all of the sentences contain direct objects. In order to decide whether there's a direct object or not, you need to begin by finding the verb and then looking to see whether there's a word that receives the action of the verb. Let's begin. The voters in Lincoln County have selected Anderson for the state legislature 4 times in a row. Let's begin by finding the verb in this sentence. The verb is have selected. Remember that some verbs contain more than one word, in which case we refer to it as a verb phrase. In this sentence, have selected is the verb phrase, which gives the action to the sentence. What is the subject of the verb have selected? That is, who or what is doing the selecting? The answer is the voters. The voters are the one who have selected. Now, is there any word that receives the action of the verb have selected? That is there any word that answers the question what or whom after the verb have selected? Well, the answer is the voters have selected Anderson. Anderson receives the action of the verb have selected, and therefore Anderson is the direct object of the verb in this sentence. The next example. General Sullivan led a fascinating tour of the historic Civil War battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Once again, what's the verb? The verb is led. The subject of the verb is General Sullivan. General Sullivan is the person who led. Now, what did General Sullivan lead? What or whom did he lead? Is there a word that answers that question? That is, a word which receives the action of the verb led? Yes, what he led was a tour, specifically a fascinating tour. But the noun tour is the key word. That's the direct object of the verb led. It tells us what General Sullivan led. The other words there, fascinating, give more information about the tour. They tell us what kind of tour it was. Notice that all the other words that follow the word tour in this sentence again go to give more information about the action. They don't receive the action directly, they just give more information about it. What kind of tour was it? It was a tour of the historic Civil War battlefield. And where was that battlefield? In Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Those two groups of words are prepositional phrases, and the prepositional phrases give more information about the action. They don't receive the action of the verb directly. One tip when you're looking for the direct object of a verb is that the direct object will never be found in a prepositional phrase. The prepositional phrase may give more information about the object, but the prepositional phrase will never contain the object of the verb. That's how we know that those words of the historic Civil War battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, don't contain the direct object. The direct object is the word tour. Next example. Paula exercised in the weight room at the local gymnasium 3 times a week this past summer. What's the verb here? The verb is exercised. What's the subject? Who did the exercising? Paula. Paula exercised, that's the subject and the verb. Now, is there a word that receives the action of the verb exercised? That is there a word that answers the question, Paula exercised what? Or Paula exercised whom? Well, the answer is there is no word that answers that question. We're not told, for example, that Paula exercised her dog, or Paula exercised her rights. Either of those might be the direct object of the verb exercised, but we're not told that at all. Paula exercised, and the action ends with the word exercised. All the other words in the sentence give more information about how and where and when she did the exercising, but they do not receive the action of the exercising. Therefore, there is no direct object for the verb exercised in this sentence. Remember, that means that the verb exercised is an intransitive verb. It doesn't have a direct object which receives the action. Next example. The theories of Isaac Newton revolutionized physics and astronomy. The verb here is revolutionized. What's the subject? The subject is theories. It was the theories that revolutionized. And what did they revolutionize? That is, what receives the action of the verb revolutionized? Well, in this case, there are two things that were revolutionized: physics and astronomy. So both of those words are part of the direct object of the verb revolutionize. So we have, in this sentence, a compound direct object. Remember, a direct object can include two or more things, joined usually by a coordinating conjunction, like and. So in this sentence, there are two direct objects joined by the word and: physics and astronomy. Our last example. Benjamin Franklin's first job was working as an apprentice in a printing shop. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is was. And perhaps you could recognize right away that this is not the kind of verb that has a direct object. Was is a form of the verb to be. And remember, to be is the most common and most important of the linking verbs. To be is naturally a verb of being rather than a verb of action. And remember that only verbs of action can be transitive verbs. Only verbs of action can pass their action along to a direct object. So this particular sentence does not have a direct object. It's the second example in this exercise of a sentence that doesn't have a direct object. The verb was has as its subject job, and what follows tells us what the job was. It was working as an apprentice in a printing shop. So was is being used as a linking verb, and what comes before and after the linking verb, those two things are being equated. We are being told that they are one and the same. This is different from having a direct object which receives the action of the verb. So for this sentence, there is no direct object. We've been talking about direct objects which receive the action of the verb. There's another type of object that a verb may have. It's called an indirect object. An indirect object is a noun or a pronoun that answers the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom, after a transitive verb. An indirect object comes between the verb and the direct object in a sentence. The sentences we've been looking at so far under the heading of direct objects contain a subject, a transitive verb, and then a direct object which receives the action of the verb. Some sentences that contain transitive verbs also contain indirect objects. Not all, not even most, but some sentences will contain that indirect object as well. The indirect object tells us to whom or for whom the action has been done, and the indirect object actually appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. If this sounds a bit confusing, look at this example, which should make it all very clear. Andrea told her mother the good news. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is told. That tells us what was done. And who or what is the subject? Andrea. Andrea is the one who did the telling. Now, what's the direct object of the verb told? That is, what did Andrea tell? Andrea told what? She told the good news. The noun news specifically is the direct object. That's what Andrea told. However, we notice there's another noun, her mother. That phrase has been stuck in between the direct object and the verb. What role does her mother play? Her mother is the indirect object. That answers the question, to whom Andrea told the good news. So the direct object is news. That's what Andrea told. And her mother is the indirect object. That's the person to whom the news was told. So you notice that a specific type of transitive verb is necessary to make an indirect object make sense. A verb like tell is one that makes sense as having an indirect object, because it's the kind of verb where you would do the action to someone or for someone. You tell someone some news. That is, you tell the news to a particular person. So in this case, mother, that noun, is the indirect object of the transitive verb told. And notice that the indirect object has been placed in between the verb and the direct object. When you learn English, that's one of the things that you learn, perhaps unconsciously. Little children who are learning English at their mother's knee never learn this rule, that is, that an indirect object appears in such and such a place in the sentence, but somehow, just from hearing hundreds and thousands of English sentences, they come to understand that a noun or pronoun that's been placed in that location in a sentence is serving in that way. It's answering the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom, and therefore it's serving as the indirect object. Here's another sentence to illustrate how this works. Stuart bought Donna a bouquet of flowers. The verb is bought. The subject is Stuart. Stuart did the buying. And what did Stuart buy? That is, what's the direct object? He bought a bouquet, specifically a bouquet of flowers. But the noun bouquet is the direct object of the verb bought. Now, for whom or to whom did he buy the bouquet? Well, he bought the bouquet for Donna. And by simply inserting the word Donna there in between the verb and the direct object, we know that Donna is serving as the indirect object. Donna tells us for whom Stuart bought the bouquet. So Donna is the noun which serves as the indirect object in this sentence. Both of the examples we've looked at so far happen to use nouns as indirect objects, but a pronoun could be used equally well. So that, for example, that same sentence could read, Stuart bought her a bouquet of flowers. In this case, the pronoun her would substitute for Donna, and it would also act as the indirect object. An indirect object would always be a noun or a pronoun, but it could be either one. Notice that an indirect object is not the object of a preposition. We've said that the indirect object answers the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom. Each of those phrases, to what, to whom, for whom, is in fact a prepositional phrase, because to and for are prepositions, and the noun or pronoun that follows them makes up, with the preposition, a prepositional phrase. However, when you actually use the prepositional phrase in a sentence, then you no longer have an indirect object, even though the meaning is exactly the same. Grammatically, it would be considered something different and would be treated differently grammatically. Let me illustrate what I mean. Look at this sentence. Ray told his little sister a story. The verb is told, the subject is Ray. The direct object, that is, what did Ray tell, is story. That's what Ray told. Now, to whom did he tell the story? Answer, sister. His little sister, more specifically. So sister is the indirect object, and it's placed just where it is supposed to be, between the verb and the direct object. Now here's another sentence that says the same thing, but doesn't contain an indirect object. Ray told a story to his little sister. In this sentence, we have the same verb, told, and the same subject, Ray. We even have the same direct object, story. That's what Ray told. Now, to whom did he tell the story? Well, he told his little sister. But in this case, little sister is not appearing as an indirect object. Notice that it's not placed between the verb and the direct object. Instead, it has been made part of a prepositional phrase and stuck on at the end of the sentence. To his little sister. The preposition to introduces the prepositional phrase. So even though the meaning is the same, in this case, the grammatical structure is different. The indirect object has been taken out of its proper place between the verb and the direct object and has been tacked on at the end with a prepositional phrase. Either construction is perfectly clear and either one is perfectly correct. We simply want to differentiate them so that you'll understand the difference between an indirect object and the object of a prepositional phrase. The meaning is the same, but grammatically they are different, and different rules would apply. Finally, an indirect object may be compound. Just as a direct object may include two or more things joined by a coordinating conjunction, the same can be true of an indirect object. Look at this sentence. Ms. Powell gave her mother and father a beautiful anniversary gift. What's the verb here? Gave. The subject, Ms. Powell. And what did Ms. Powell give? That is, what's the direct object? The answer, gift. She gave a gift, specifically a beautiful anniversary gift. Now, to whom did she give the gift? That is, what's the indirect object of the verb gave? The answer is mother and father. There are two indirect objects in this sentence because there are two people to whom the gift was given. Those two words, mother and father, joined by the coordinating conjunction and, go together to make up a compound indirect object in this sentence. Try your hand at the next exercise in your study guide, which will give you a chance to practice the skills and information we've just shared with you. In this exercise, we gave you several sentences and asked you to decide for each one whether or not an indirect object appears. Let's take a look at them one by one. First, Moesha wrote her grandmother a long letter thanking her for the birthday gift. It's usually a good way to start to look for the verb in a sentence like this, and then work from the verb outward. What's the verb in this sentence? The answer is wrote. Wrote is the word that contains the action of the sentence. And who or what is the subject? Who did the writing? The answer, Moesha. Now, is there a direct object? That is there something in the sentence which tells us what Moesha wrote? Something that receives the action of the verb wrote. Yes, what Moesha wrote was a letter, specifically a long letter. So the word letter is the direct object of the verb wrote. It tells us what Moesha wrote. Now the tricky question, is there an indirect object? That is there something in the sentence that tells us to what, to whom, or for whom the letter was written? Well, the letter was written to Moesha's grandmother, and that noun grandmother appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. Therefore, it's in the right place for an indirect object, and that, in fact, is what it is. So the noun grandmother is the indirect object here. It answers the question, to whom Moesha wrote the letter. And that's the answer for this first question. Next, after 2 days of debate, the town council awarded the road maintenance contract to a company owned by several local citizens. It's a long, complicated sentence, but let's break it down piece by piece, and I think you'll find it's not that difficult to understand. First, what's the verb? What's the action that's happening in this sentence? The answer is awarded. Who or what is the subject of the verb awarded? Who did the awarding? The answer, council, or more specifically, the town council. So council is the subject. Now, is there a direct object? Is there a word that tells us what the town council awarded? Yes, the answer is contract. They awarded the contract, or more specifically, the road maintenance contract. Now, what about an indirect object? Is there a word or phrase that answers the question to whom or to what the road maintenance contract was awarded? Well, the answer in a way is yes, the contract was awarded to a company owned by several local citizens. But this is not being used as an indirect object. Remember, an indirect object would have to be placed between the verb and the direct object. And that's not where the company is placed. The company instead is tacked on at the end of the sentence. Furthermore, notice that the company is mentioned in a prepositional phrase. And as we saw a moment ago, an indirect object is never part of a prepositional phrase. So in this case, company is not an indirect object. Instead, it's part of the prepositional phrase to a company, and therefore it is not, grammatically speaking, an indirect object, even though it answers the same question and conveys much the same meaning. From a grammatical standpoint, it's not an indirect object. Let's look at our next example. Every evening, Richard and Emily cooked us a wonderful meal using fresh ingredients from the local farm stands. What's the verb here? The verb is cooked. That describes the action of the sentence. Who or what did the cooking? Richard and Emily. They're the subject of the verb cooked, and it's, of course, a compound subject because there are two nouns there linked by the coordinating conjunction and. So Richard and Emily cooked. Now, what did they cook? That is, what's the direct object of the verb? What they cooked is a wonderful meal. So the noun meal is the direct object. Now, is there an indirect object, a word that appears between the verb and the direct object, which answers the question to what, to whom, for what, or for whom? Yes, the answer is us. The pronoun us answers the question for whom the wonderful meal was cooked. Lucky us. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object. It answers the question for whom the meal was cooked, and it appears between the verb and the direct object. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object in this sentence. Next example. Each candidate prepared a written statement for the selection committee. What's the verb here? The verb is prepared. Who or what did the preparing? Each candidate. So the verb is prepared. What's the direct object? That is, do we know who or what the candidates prepared? Well, they prepared a written statement. So the noun statement is the direct object. Is there an indirect object, a word appearing between the verb and the direct object, which tells to whom or for whom the statement was prepared? The answer is no. There is no indirect object here. Once again, as in a previous example, we have an answer to the question for whom the statement was prepared, but it appears in the form of a prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, rather than as a true indirect object. So the selection committee is the object of the preposition for, and that's simply a prepositional phrase that gives more information about the action. It really doesn't serve grammatically as an indirect object. So this sentence is another example of one that doesn't contain an indirect object. Our last example. 2 minutes before game time, the coach gave her players a final reminder about the crucial importance of teamwork. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is gave. Who or what gave? The coach gave. So coach is the subject of the verb gave. Now, who or what did the coach give? What is the direct object of the verb gave? Well, what the coach gave was a reminder, specifically a final reminder. So reminder is the direct object of the verb gave. Now, does the sentence contain an indirect object, a word that tells us to whom or for whom that reminder was given? Yes, the answer is her players. So the noun players, which does appear between the verb and the direct object, is the indirect object in this sentence. It answers the question to whom the coach gave the reminder, and it appears in the proper location in the sentence, and therefore players is the indirect object in this sentence. Now, so far, we've looked at direct objects and indirect objects, and both of these are used in sentences that contain transitive verbs. Sentences that contain intransitive verbs don't have objects of any kind. The action of the sentence basically stops with the subject and the verb. Of course, modifying words and phrases may be added, but none of those constitutes an object of the action. Now, what about the third type of verb, that is the linking verb? Well, linking verbs are used with a different type of sentence complement known as subject complements. A subject complement is a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective that follows a linking verb and refers to, describes, or modifies the subject. Remember earlier in this program when we talked about how linking verbs work, we pointed out that linking verbs always connect the subject to something that follows the linking verb and which is being equated to the subject. We're being told that the subject is what follows the linking verb. Well, what follows the linking verb is a subject complement, and it will be either a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. Of course, other modifying words and phrases may be added, but when you're looking for the subject complement, you want to look for a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective following the linking verb, which is in some way being equated to or linked to the subject. Here are some examples. Virginia Woolf was a novelist. Was is the verb in this sentence, and it's a linking verb. As we've said many times, the most common linking verb is the verb to be, and was is a form of the verb to be. The subject of was is Virginia Woolf, a particular woman's name. So Virginia Woolf was, and what follows is the subject complement. The noun novelist describes or modifies the subject, Virginia Woolf. It gives us more information about Virginia Woolf. It tells us what Virginia Woolf was, specifically a novelist. So was, the linking verb, is linking Virginia Woolf and novelist and telling us that the two things were equated to one another. Virginia Woolf was a novelist. The two things are one and the same. So this is a classic example of a linking verb being used to connect the subject to a noun, novelist, which is the subject complement. Here's a different example. The world's greatest bullfighter is he. What's the verb here? The verb is. It's another form of the common linking verb to be. What's the subject of the verb is? The subject is bullfighter. That's the noun, which is the subject of the verb, and the other words there give more information about bullfighter. Which specific bullfighter? The world's greatest bullfighter. Now, what follows the linking verb is the subject complement. We said that a subject complement may be a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective. Here's an example of a pronoun being used as the subject complement. He. This is a rather unusual kind of subject complement. You probably don't hear a lot of sentences like this. And indeed, pronouns are the most unusual kind of subject complement. But we thought we ought to give you this sentence because we've made the point that a subject complement may be a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. So here's an example using a pronoun, he, as the subject complement. Notice that the pronoun he rather than him is correct. We have a separate program in this series which talks all about using pronouns correctly. And we'll talk about pronoun case in that program. And pronoun case is what differentiates he from him. When a pronoun is being used as a subject complement, you would use what's called the nominative case, which is he rather than him. And that's technically why he is correct. This kind of sentence doesn't come up very often. Perhaps the most common situation in which the use of a pronoun as a subject complement comes up would be when you knock on someone's door and they say, "Who's there?" and you respond, "It is I." That would be a common use of the pronoun I as a subject complement. And because it's a subject complement, you want to use the nominative case I rather than me. So "it is I" is correct rather than "it is me." It's a small matter, doesn't come up a lot, but we've covered it now, and we're ready to move on to our third example of a subject complement. Sandra looked happy. Here, the verb is looked. The subject is Sandra. And looked in this case is being used as a linking verb because what follows isn't receiving the action of the verb, but rather it's equating or being equated to the subject. What follows is the adjective happy, which describes, modifies, refers to, or gives more information about the subject. We're being told that Sandra was happy. So Sandra and happy are being equated to one another. We're being told those two things are one and the same, Sandra and happy. So looked is acting here as a linking verb, and what follows is an adjective being used as the subject complement. So once again, a subject complement follows a linking verb, and it can be either a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. And just like the other forms of sentence complements that we've looked at in this program, a subject complement may be compound. In other words, there may be more than one word included in the subject complement, and the two or more words would normally be joined by a coordinating conjunction. For example, Gary is a singer and a dancer. Here we have the linking verb is, linking the subject Gary to two words which are nouns, which are the subject complements, singer, dancer. One more example. My favorite sports teams are the Denver Nuggets and the Colorado Rockies. Here the linking verb is are. Teams is the subject, more specifically, my favorite sports teams. And there are two nouns that serve as subject complements, Denver Nuggets and Colorado Rockies. Another example of how the subject complement can be compound. Try your hand at the next exercise in your study guide, which will give you a chance to practice the skills and information we've just shared with you. In some of these sentences, but not all, there's a subject complement. Let's look at each one and see if we can locate the subject complement. First, the original nickname of the Houston Astros baseball team was the Colt 45s. First, look for the verb. The verb is was, and it is a linking verb, and that means we can probably expect to find a subject complement here. What's the subject of the linking verb was? The answer is nickname. We're being told in this sentence what the nickname was. Specifically, which nickname? The original nickname of the Houston Astros baseball team. But the noun nickname is the subject. And what's the subject complement? Where are we told what that nickname was? The answer is the Colt 45s. That's a noun that's being linked with nickname, and the two things are being equated. The nickname was Colt 45s. So Colt 45s is the answer. That's the subject complement in this sentence. Next example. Many investors use mutual funds as a way of buying shares in a wide range of companies. The verb here is use. Now, is use a verb of action or a verb of being? Well, the answer is it's a verb of action. It tells us something that the subject, investors, do, rather than something that they are. So use is not a linking verb. In fact, it's a transitive verb, and therefore will not be followed by a subject complement. What follows the transitive verb use is mutual funds, which is the direct object of the verb use. So this particular sentence doesn't contain a subject complement. Remember, only a linking verb will be followed by a subject complement. Next, after being reupholstered, the wing chair looked new. What's the verb here? The verb is looked. The subject is chair or wing chair. So the chair looked something. What did it look? It looked new. New is an adjective which describes or modifies or gives more information about the wing chair. So new, that adjective, is a subject complement. Looked is being used here as a linking verb. We're being told, in effect, what the wing chair was. It was new. The linking verb looked is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And so what follows, the adjective new, is being used as a subject complement. Next, Ronald Reagan became the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. What's the verb here? The verb is became, and the subject is Ronald Reagan. So we're being told in this sentence what Ronald Reagan became. Now, became in this sentence is, again, being used as a linking verb. What follows it is what Ronald Reagan was. Once again, the linking verb, even though it's not, in this case, a form of the verb to be, is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And what was Ronald Reagan? Well, he was the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. The noun person is the subject complement in this particular sentence, and all the other words that follow the verb there serve to give more information about exactly what kind of person, the oldest person, and so on. So in this particular sentence, the linking verb is became, and the subject complement is the noun person. Our final example. The hikers were exhausted and ravenous after their trek up Mount Washington. What's the verb in this sentence? Well, the verb is were, and were, of course, is a form of the verb to be, which is the most common and important of the linking verbs. The subject of the verb were is hikers, and what follows the verb were is what the hikers were. Therefore, it's the subject complement that gives us more information about the hikers. And the hikers were two things. They were exhausted and ravenous. Those are both adjectives which give more information about the hikers. So in this case, we have a compound subject complement. Two adjectives joined by the coordinating conjunction and both of those words go to give us more information about the subject of the linking verb were. Let's quickly review. In this program, we've talked about three kinds of sentence complements: direct objects, indirect objects, and subject complements. Remember that direct objects and indirect objects are used only with transitive verbs, while subject complements are used only with linking verbs. Now let's step back for just a moment. We've seen now how complete sentences are constructed. There's a verb in the middle, a subject usually appearing before the verb, and then very often a sentence complement of some kind that comes after the verb. You might almost think of a sentence as a lever or a teeter-totter, something like a seesaw, with the verb as being the fulcrum, the balancing point in the middle. The subject usually comes before that, and the sentence complement, if there is one, comes after that. You now have the complete structure of what most typical English sentences look like. And all the other words and phrases that may be added onto the sentence serve to give more information about or to modify the subject or the verb or the sentence complement. So if you understand how these three major parts of a sentence work together and how different parts of speech can be used to modify or give more information about them, you'll understand how virtually every English sentence is constructed. And that will make it much easier for you to create your own English sentences that are both grammatically correct and express your ideas clearly. I hope you found this program useful. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on other programs in this series.